In the quiet hours of evening, when the sky had turned from blue to deep violet and the first stars were just beginning to appear, there lived millions of ordinary people scattered across the world who were learning what it meant to carry a weight they had never asked for. They were mothers and fathers, children and grandparents, young soldiers and factory workers, teachers and shopkeepers, farmers and nurses. They were people who had once planned ordinary lives filled with ordinary joys, and then the world had changed, and they found themselves living through something that would mark them forever, quietly and deeply, in ways that even they themselves sometimes struggled to understand. This was the time of the Second World War, those long years from the late 1930s into the mid-1940s, when the entire world seemed caught in a great storm of conflict and uncertainty. But this is not a story about battles or strategies, about generals or politicians making grand decisions in distant rooms. This is a story about what happened inside the hearts and minds of ordinary people as they tried to get through each day, each night, each endless stretch of worry and waiting and hoping that tomorrow might bring some small relief, some hint that this darkness would not last forever. Picture, if you will, a quiet street in London on a September evening in 1940. The sun has set and the blackout curtains are drawn in every window, making the houses look like they have closed their eyes against the night. Inside one of these houses, a woman sits at her kitchen table, writing a letter by the dim light of a single candle. Her husband is somewhere in France, or perhaps North Africa by now. She cannot always keep track, and the letters arrive weeks after they are written, arriving in the wrong order so that she reads about events that have already passed, that may have already been followed by other events she knows nothing about. She writes carefully, trying to keep her tone light and cheerful, telling him about the small happenings of home, about the neighbours and the garden and the funny thing their daughter said yesterday. She does not mention how she lies awake at night listening for the air raid sirens, how her hands shake sometimes for no reason, how she has started having dreams where she's searching for him in a crowd, but can never quite reach him no matter how hard she tries. She does not mention these things because she knows he has enough to worry about, and besides, what good would it do? Some burdens, she has learned, must be carried silently. In another part of the city, down in the underground station that has become an improvised shelter, families are settling in for another night. They have brought blankets and pillows, thermoses of tea, small bundles of possessions they grab whenever the sirens begin their wailing cry. The platform is crowded, people press close together, the air thick with the smell of too many bodies in too small a space, with the scent of tea and sweat and damp wool. A little boy, perhaps 6 years old, lies with his head in his mother's lap. He's trying to sleep, but sleep is difficult here, with the constant murmur of voices, the occasional cry of a baby, the rumble of trains that still run on other lines deeper in the earth. His mother strokes his hair absently, her own eyes fixed on nothing, seeing something far away. She's thinking about her husband, who drives an ambulance through the bombed streets, who comes home sometimes with stories he tries not to tell, with a look in his eyes that frightens her more than any of the bombs. The little boy does not understand everything that is happening. He knows there is a war. He knows that sometimes there are loud noises in the night and bright flashes of light, and then in the morning there might be a pile of broken bricks where a building used to stand. He knows that his father looks very tired, and that his mother's smile does not always reach her eyes the way it used to. He knows that some of his friends have gone away to the countryside to stay with strangers, to be safe, and he wonders sometimes if he should have gone too, though the thought of being away from his mother makes his stomach feel strange and tight. Across the channel, In a small town in northern France that has been occupied for several months now, a family sits in their darkened kitchen, speaking in whispers, though there is no one to hear them. The father, a schoolteacher before the war, has been trying to decide whether to join the resistance, to do something, anything, to push back against the occupation. But he has a wife and 2 daughters to think about, and he knows what happens to the families of resistance members who are caught. So he sits, night after night, torn between the pull to act and the desperate need to keep his family safe, the weight of this impossible choice pressing down on him like a physical thing. His wife watches him, knowing what he is thinking because they have had this conversation in circles, never quite saying everything they mean, never quite coming to a decision. She is frightened, but she is also proud of him for even considering such a dangerous path. She's exhausted from the constant tension of occupation, from having to watch every word she says, from the knowledge that their neighbours might be informants, that trust has become a luxury they cannot afford. She misses the simplicity of the life they had before, when her biggest worry was whether the garden would yield enough vegetables, when the world made sense in straightforward ways. In the Pacific, on a small island whose name most people back home have never heard and cannot pronounce, a young American soldier sits in a foxhole, staring up at a sky full of stars more brilliant than any he has ever seen. He is 19 years old, from a small town in Iowa, and 6 months ago he was working on his father's farm, planning to marry his sweetheart, thinking about the future in simple, hopeful terms. Now he is here, in this place that feels like the end of the earth, and he has seen things that he knows he will never be able to fully explain to anyone who was not there with him. He thinks about home constantly, obsessively, replaying memories like a movie in his mind. The smell of his mother's kitchen, the sound of his father's laugh, the way his girl's hand felt in his that last evening before he left, when they walked by the creek and she cried and he promised her he would come home. He holds on to these memories like talismans, like proof that there is still something good and real in the world, something worth surviving for. But he also knows that something in him has changed, is changing every day he is here. He has discovered that he can function on almost no sleep, that he can eat food that would have made him sick before, that he can make himself small and still and nearly invisible when he needs to. He has learned that fear and boredom can exist at the same time, that hours of nothing can turn into moments of terror so quickly that his heart never quite settles back into its normal rhythm. He has learned things about himself, about what he is capable of, and some of these things frighten him more than the enemy ever could. In Berlin, in the basement of an apartment building that shakes with each nearby explosion, a woman holds her 2 children close and sings to them softly. The same lullabies her mother sang to her when she was small. Her husband is somewhere on the Eastern Front, if he is still alive. She has had no word for 3 months now. She lives in a constant state of suspended grief, mourning someone who might still be breathing, hoping for someone who might already be gone. The bombs are closer tonight than they have been in weeks, and she can feel the building shudder, can hear plaster cracking somewhere above. But she keeps singing, keeps her voice steady because her children are watching her face, taking their cues from her, and if she stays calm they will believe they are safe. This is what she tells herself anyway, though she knows that calm and safe are not the same thing, that her steadiness is a performance that costs her more than they will ever know. She thinks sometimes about what will come after, if there is an after. She thinks about how she will explain all of this to her children when they are older, how she will help them make sense of the senselessness. She thinks about the Germany that existed before, the one she grew up in, and she grieves for it even as she grieves for the Germany that exists now, for all the ways that her country has been twisted into something she barely recognizes, for all the choices that were made that led to this moment of cowering in abasement while the world explodes above. These people, in their different corners of the world, in their different circumstances and allegiances, were all living through the same vast historical event, but they were experiencing it in deeply personal, profoundly intimate ways. The war was not just a series of dates and battles and political decisions. It was millions of individual moments of fear and courage, of grief and endurance, of love that persisted even when everything else seemed to be falling apart. They were learning lessons they had never wanted to learn. They were discovering reserves of strength they had not known they possessed. They were being changed day by day, night by night, in ways that would stay with them for the rest of their lives, in ways that would shape not just their own futures, but the futures of their children and grandchildren, rippling forward through time like stones thrown into still water. The war did something to people, something that went deeper than physical wounds or material loss. It taught them about uncertainty, about living in a state of constant low-grade fear that became so familiar it felt almost like a normal state of being. It taught them about grief, not just the sharp, immediate grief of losing someone you love, but the duller, more persistent grief of losing the world as you knew it, of watching familiar structures and certainties crumble and not knowing what would rise in their place. It taught them about endurance, about the strange human capacity to adapt to almost anything, to find routines and small comforts even in the midst of chaos. It taught them about community, about how crisis can bring people together or tear them apart, about the complex dance of trust and suspicion that characterized life in occupied territories or in cities under siege. It taught them about moral complexity, about how the lines between right and wrong could blur in ways they had never imagined, how ordinary people could be called upon to make impossible choices, how survival itself could require compromises that would haunt them forever. It taught them about powerlessness, about what it meant to have your life utterly controlled by forces beyond your influence, to be swept up in events you had no part in creating and no ability to stop. And in the quiet moments, in the brief pauses between crisis and crisis, it taught them about the resilience of the human spirit, about how love could persist in the unlikeliest circumstances, how humour could bubble up even in the darkest times, how small acts of kindness could shine like beacons in the surrounding gloom. It taught them that human beings are capable of both tremendous cruelty and tremendous compassion, often existing side by side, sometimes even in the same person. The war was reshaping people from the inside out, moulding them into versions of themselves that would have been unrecognizable to who they were before. A young man who'd been gentle and bookish discovered he could kill. A woman who had been timid found she could stand up to soldiers with rifles. A child who had been carefree learned to sleep through bomb raids and wake instantly at the sound of his mother's whisper. These transformations were not always dramatic or obvious. Often they happened so gradually that the people themselves did not fully realize how much they had changed until much later, when they looked back and could barely remember who they had been before the war began. The nights were particularly difficult, particularly heavy with this weight of transformation and fear. In the darkness, with the blackout curtains drawn and no light to push back the shadows, fears grew larger, more insistent. In the darkness, memories of lost loved ones became more vivid, more painful. In the darkness, the future seemed most uncertain, most frightening. And yet, It was also in the darkness that people sometimes found their deepest reserves of courage, their most profound connections with one another. In a shelter in London, a woman who has never spoken to her neighbours before finds herself sharing her fears with a stranger, and the stranger shares back, and in this exchange they both feel a little less alone. In a farmhouse in Poland, a family hiding refugees in their attic lies awake listening for the sound of boots on the road, terrified but also feeling a fierce pride in their choice to help, to resist in this small but dangerous way. In a hospital tent near the front lines, a nurse holds the hand of a dying soldier who is calling for his mother, and she murmurs comfort to him, though he is a stranger to her, and in this moment she is giving everything she has to offer, knowing it will not be enough to save him, but hoping it might bring him some small peace at the end. In a prison camp, men who've been reduced to the barest essentials of survival still find ways to share what little they have, still tell each other jokes, still hold on to scraps of hope that someday they will return to their families, to their lives. They are being broken down, yes, but they are also discovering what cannot be broken, what remains when everything else is stripped away. This was what getting through World War II did to people. It broke some of them. It hardened some of them. It opened the hearts of some and closed the hearts of others. It created scars, visible and invisible, that would never fully heal. It planted seeds of trauma that would grow and flower in unexpected ways in the decades to come, affecting relationships, affecting choices, affecting how people raised their children and understood the world. But it also revealed capacities for endurance and compassion that might never have been discovered in easier times. It created bonds of shared experience that would last lifetimes. It taught lessons about what truly matters, about the difference between the essential and the trivial, lessons that would reshape priorities and values in profound ways. And as the war ground on, year after year, these ordinary people in their extraordinary circumstances kept waking up each morning and deciding to continue, to survive one more day, to hold on to hope even when hope seemed foolish, to love even when love brought the risk of devastating loss. They kept writing letters and sharing meals and singing lullabies and finding reasons to smile, small reasons maybe, but real ones. Reasons that helped them remember that they were still human, still alive, still capable of joy even in the midst of sorrow. The story of what the war did to people is really the story of what people did with the war, how they carried it, how they survived it, how they were marked by it but not destroyed by it. It is a story of resilience and fragility both, of strength and vulnerability coexisting in the same hearts. It is a story that needs to be told gently, with care, with recognition of both the suffering and the survival, the loss and the endurance. As the evening deepened into night in all these places, as stars appeared in skies that knew both beauty and horror, as people settled into sleep or wakefulness according to the demands of their circumstances, they carried on. They lived their lives as best they could. They held each other when they could. They hoped. They feared. They grieved. They loved. They survived. And in surviving, they were changed, marked forever by these times that asked more of them than any time should ask, but that also revealed to them depths of human experience, both terrible and wonderful, that they might never have known in easier days. The daily struggle to survive during the Second World War was not primarily about grand acts of heroism or dramatic moments of crisis, though those certainly occurred. Instead, for most people, it was about the accumulation of small difficulties, small decisions, small compromises and accommodations that added up over time to a completely different way of living. A constant background hum of worry and scarcity and adjustment that coloured every waking moment. For families in cities that came under bombardment, each day began with an assessment of what had changed overnight. In London during the Blitz, people would wake and wonder if the building across the street would still be standing, if the grocer's shop would be open, if the water mains had been hit again. They would emerge from shelters, stiff and tired from sleeping on hard platforms or in cramped basements, and make their way through streets where the glass crunched underfoot like snow, where the smell of destruction, that peculiar mix of brick dust and smoke and broken plaster, had become as familiar as the smell of bread baking. A woman might walk to the market to see what food was available, her ration book clutched in her hand, mentally calculating what she could make with whatever she could get. Rationing was not just about having less food. It was about the mental work of constant planning and improvisation, about trying to provide adequate nutrition for growing children from increasingly limited resources, about the creativity required to make a small piece of meat stretch across several meals, to bake cakes without eggs or butter, to serve meals that looked and tasted like real food even when they were made from substitutes and extenders. She would stand in queues, sometimes for hours, because it was rumoured that this shop or that had received a shipment of something, oranges perhaps, or tinned meat, or even just a bit of extra sugar. Standing in queues became a central feature of wartime life, a strange kind of social ritual where people swapped rumours and complaints, where small kindnesses were exchanged, where the slow passage of time was marked by shuffling forward a few feet every few minutes. The mental energy required for this constant vigilance, this endless strategizing about resources, was exhausting in ways that were hard to quantify. It was not just about being hungry, though many people were. It was about the cognitive load of making every item stretch, of never wasting anything, of being always alert for opportunities to acquire what was needed. It meant saving scraps of fat for cooking, reusing tea leaves until they produced only coloured water, darning stockings until there was more darn than stocking, cutting down adult clothes to make children's wear, growing vegetables in every available patch of dirt. For children, the daily struggle to survive took on different dimensions. Many children in British cities were evacuated to the countryside, sent to live with strangers, separated from their parents in the name of safety. These evacuations were supposed to be temporary, a matter of weeks or months, but often stretched into years. The psychological impact of this separation was profound and lasting. A child arriving in a rural village, labelled with a tag like a piece of luggage, standing in a hall while local families looked them over and chose which ones to take home, learned early about powerlessness, about being assessed and possibly found wanting. Some children were fortunate and ended up with families who treated them kindly, who made them feel welcome and cared for. Others were less lucky, placed with people who resented the burden, who used them for labour, who made them feel like unwanted impositions. The evacuated children learned to live split lives, part of them still attached to the families they had left behind, part of them trying to fit into these new, strange households. They received letters from parents who seemed increasingly distant, increasingly unreal. They forgot the sounds of their mothers' voices, the layouts of their old homes. They developed new attachments, new routines, and then felt guilty about these attachments, felt like they were betraying their real families by caring about these substitute ones. When they eventually returned home, sometimes years later, they found that they had become strangers to their own parents, and their parents to them. The child who left at 6 and returned at 10 was a completely different person, shaped by experiences the parents had not shared. The parents, meanwhile, had been shaped by their own war experiences, had perhaps lost other children to bombing or disease, had aged in ways that went beyond the passage of years. The reunions were often joyful but also deeply awkward, shot through with grief for all the time that had been lost, for the growing up that had happened on both sides without the other to witness it. Children who remained in the cities, who lived through the nightly bombing raids, developed their own adaptations. They learned to sleep through noise that would once have terrified them. They became experts at identifying aircraft by sound, at judging the danger level of different types of explosions. They played in the rubble of destroyed buildings, using bombed-out homes as playgrounds, finding a strange kind of normalcy in the ruins. But the fear was always there, buried under the surface of play and routine. It manifested in nightmares, in bedwetting that had stopped years before but suddenly returned, in clinging behaviour, in questions that had no good answers. Why did the bombs come? Would Daddy come home? Was it their fault somehow that all this was happening? Children's magical thinking, their need to make sense of the world and their place in it, could lead them to take on responsibility for events entirely beyond their control. For soldiers, the daily struggle was different still. Those fighting on the front lines lived in a state of heightened awareness that was utterly exhausting, where every sound might signal danger, where sleep had to be snatched in brief, unsatisfying increments, where the body was pushed to limits that seemed impossible to sustain. They learned to function while bone-tired, while frightened, while sick from bad food or contaminated water, or the sheer stress of it all. They developed routines and rituals, small superstitions that gave them a sense of control in an environment where they had almost no control. A certain pair of socks that they believed was lucky, a photograph they touched before each mission, a prayer or phrase they repeated to themselves. These little actions became anchors, tiny islands of personal agency in a sea of chaos and orders from above. The daily life of a soldier was a strange mixture of intense boredom and sudden terror, hours and hours of waiting, of routine tasks, of letter writing and card playing and endless conversations about home, punctuated by brief periods of combat so intense that they seemed to exist outside of normal time, where minutes stretched into hours and hours compressed into seconds, where the world narrowed down to immediate survival and nothing else existed. Soldiers learned to compartmentalize, to separate the person who killed or witnessed death from the person who wrote cheerful letters home or laughed at a joke. They learned not to think too deeply about what they were doing, about the people on the other end of their weapons, because thinking too much made it impossible to function. They learned to shut down certain parts of themselves, to seal off emotions that would interfere with the necessities of combat and survival. But this shutting down came at a cost that would only become fully apparent later. Emotions that were pushed aside did not disappear. They accumulated, waiting for a time when the immediate danger had passed and there was space to feel them. The things that soldiers saw and did created memories that would intrude unbidden for decades to come. Flashbacks triggered by sounds or smells or random associations. Nightmares that replayed variations on real events, always ending badly, always leaving the dreamer jolted awake with a racing heart. For those in occupied territories, the daily struggle took on particular nuances of fear and moral complexity. In France, in the Netherlands, in Poland, in all the countries that found themselves under enemy control, people had to navigate impossible situations every single day. They had to decide how to respond to the occupying forces, how to balance survival with resistance, how to live with themselves regardless of what they chose. A shopkeeper in Paris had to decide whether to serve German soldiers who came into his store with money to spend. Refusing might be satisfying, might feel like resistance, but it could also mean losing his business, his only source of income, his ability to feed his family. Serving them felt like collaboration, like a betrayal of his country. But what choice did he have? Every transaction became a small moral dilemma, a reminder of powerlessness, a source of shame regardless of the decision made. A teacher in Amsterdam had to decide what to do when she was ordered to remove Jewish students from her classroom. She could comply and keep her job, continue to influence and educate the remaining students, continue to have access to resources that her own family needed. Or she could refuse and lose everything, possibly be arrested, certainly be prevented from teaching at all. What was the right choice? How did you weigh your own family's needs against the rights of other children, against the moral principle of the thing? These impossible choices created wounds that festered even if they never showed on the surface. People carried guilt for choices they had been forced to make, guilt for surviving when others did not, guilt for compromises that felt like collaborations, guilt for not doing more, for not being braver, for being human and frail and frightened. This guilt would linger long after the war ended, shaping relationships and self-perceptions in ways that were often invisible to others, but acutely painful to the person carrying it. The physical aspects of daily survival were challenging enough. Finding adequate food and fuel, maintaining basic hygiene when water might be contaminated or in short supply, treating illnesses and injuries with limited medical supplies, keeping warm in winters when coal was rationed and clothing was wearing out and could not be replaced. But the psychological aspects were in many ways harder, more insidious, more difficult to address or even acknowledge. The constant uncertainty wore people down, not knowing if your loved one was alive or dead, not knowing when the next air raid would come, not knowing if the knock on the door meant news or disaster, not knowing how long the war would last, whether you would survive it, what the world would look like on the other side. This uncertainty created a kind of suspended animation, a difficulty in planning for the future, or even imagining a future, a sense of being trapped in an endless grey present. The isolation was painful too. Families separated by war, by evacuation, by military service, by deportation. Letters that took weeks or months to arrive, if they arrived at all, letters that were censored so you could not say what you really meant, could not describe what you were really feeling or experiencing. Phone calls that were impossible or prohibitively expensive. The inability to be present for important moments, births and deaths and marriages, all the milestones that normally connect families across generations. People learned to live with absence, with empty chairs at the table, with bedrooms that stayed empty, with the knowledge that someone they loved was somewhere in the world, facing danger they could not share or mitigate. This absence became a constant presence, a ghost that haunted every moment, every decision. Mothers cooked meals for children who were hundreds of miles away. Wives slept on one side of the bed, leaving the other side empty out of habit or hope or stubborn insistence that the absent person still had a place here, was still part of the family even if they were far away. The need to maintain normalcy in the face of abnormality was exhausting. Parents trying to create some semblance of routine for their children, trying to celebrate birthdays and holidays even when there was little to celebrate with, trying to keep the framework of ordinary life intact even as the contents of that life became more and more stripped down. Teachers continuing to teach even in makeshift classrooms, even when their students were distracted by hunger and fear, even when the curriculum seemed absurd given what everyone was living through. This insistence on normalcy was both a survival strategy and a form of resistance. It was a way of saying that the war might control many things, but it could not completely destroy the basic human activities that gave life structure and meaning. It was a way of preserving identity, of maintaining a connection to the pre-war world and the hoped-for post-war world. But it also required enormous effort, a constant pushing against the tide of chaos and fear, and that effort took its toll. The daily struggle to survive during World War II was thus a struggle on multiple levels simultaneously. It was practical and logistical, the challenge of securing basic necessities under conditions of scarcity and danger. It was psychological and emotional, the challenge of maintaining mental health and hope in circumstances that eroded both. It was moral and spiritual, the challenge of preserving one's sense of self and values in situations that constantly tested and strained them. And for the millions of people who lived through these years, these daily struggles accumulated into experiences that would shape the rest of their lives. The habits formed during wartime, the lessons learned, the scars acquired, both visible and invisible, would persist long after the guns fell silent and the rubble was cleared away. The war was not just something that happened to them. It was something that happened inside them, changing who they were at fundamental levels, creating new understandings of what humans were capable of enduring, what they were capable of doing to one another, what they were capable of surviving. The hidden weight on people's minds during World War II was perhaps heavier than the physical burdens they carried, though it was much less visible, much less acknowledged. In a time when people were expected to keep calm and carry on, to maintain a stiff upper lip, to be stoic in the face of adversity, there was little room for acknowledging the psychological and emotional toll the war was taking. People were encouraged to be brave, to be strong, to not give in to fear or despair. But bravery does not mean the absence of fear, and strength does not mean invulnerability. The emotions were there, churning beneath the surface, taking their toll in ways that would only become fully apparent in the years and decades to come. Fear was perhaps the most constant companion. Not necessarily the sharp, acute fear that comes with immediate danger, though there was certainly plenty of that. But more insidious was the chronic, low-grade fear that became the background against which all of life was lived. The fear that accompanied every goodbye, every departure, because you never knew if this might be the last time you saw this person. The fear that came with every unexpected knock on the door, because it might be a telegram bringing news of a death. The fear that lived in the sound of air raid sirens, in the drone of approaching aircraft, in any sudden loud noise that might signal danger. This constant state of hypervigilance was exhausting. The body and mind cannot maintain high alert indefinitely without consequences. People developed stress-related illnesses, headaches and stomach problems and skin conditions that were really manifestations of the anxiety they were carrying but could not fully express or address. They had trouble sleeping, lying awake listening for sounds of danger, or sleeping so lightly that any disturbance would wake them instantly. They startled easily, their nervous systems on a hair trigger, ready to react to threat even when no immediate threat existed. Children absorbed this anxiety from the adults around them, even when the adults tried to hide it. Children are exquisitely attuned to the emotional states of their caregivers, and no amount of cheerful pretending could entirely mask the underlying fear and tension. So children became anxious too, developed their own hypervigilance, their own difficulties with sleep, their own stress-related symptoms. They became afraid of the dark, afraid of loud noises, afraid of being separated from their parents even briefly. The fear was made worse by the uncertainty. If people had known how long the war would last, if they had known that they would survive it, the fear might have been more bearable. But they did not know. The war might last for years more, or it might end tomorrow. They might survive, or they might be killed in the next air raid, or they might slowly starve, or they might die of disease brought on by the privations and stress. This not knowing created a kind of existential anxiety that was extremely difficult to live with. Grief was another constant presence, though the nature and expression of grief varied widely depending on circumstances. There was the sharp, overwhelming grief of losing a loved one, of receiving that telegram that began with the words that no one wanted to see. This kind of grief demanded expression, but the circumstances of war did not always allow for the mourning that would have been normal in peacetime. Funerals might be hasty or impossible. Bodies might be buried in foreign soil or lost entirely. The rituals that usually helped people process loss and say goodbye were often unavailable. And even when formal mourning was possible, there was social pressure not to dwell too long on grief, not to let it interfere with the war effort, to soldier on and keep contributing. Widows were expected to control their weeping, to present a brave face to the world, to manage their households and raise their children despite the shattering loss they had experienced. Parents who lost children, the most unnatural loss of all, were expected to be stoic, to find comfort in the knowledge that their child had died for a cause, though this knowledge was cold comfort indeed. But there was also a more diffuse, less acknowledged grief for the loss of the world as it had been. People grieved for the end of peace, for the destruction of cities and landscapes they had loved, for the loss of innocence and optimism about human nature. They grieved for opportunities lost, for the years of their lives consumed by war, for the dreams and plans that had to be abandoned or indefinitely postponed. Young people grieved for the normal adolescence or young adulthood they would never have, for the chance to fall in love without the shadow of war, to pursue education or career without interruption, to simply grow up without bearing the weight of adult worries and responsibilities. Older people grieved for the peaceful retirement they had imagined, for the chance to see their children and grandchildren grow up in safety, for the stable world order they had believed existed and that had turned out to be so fragile. This grief for the lost world was complicated because it felt somewhat selfish or trivial compared to the grief of those who had lost loved ones. How could you mourn for interrupted plans when other people were mourning for dead children? But the grief was real nonetheless, and the inability to fully acknowledge or express it meant that it lingered, unresolved, adding to the heavy emotional burden that people carried. Loneliness was pervasive, even for people who were surrounded by others. The loneliness of the soldier far from home, sleeping in foxholes or crowded barracks, but feeling utterly alone with his thoughts and fears. The loneliness of the wife whose husband was gone, who slept in an empty bed and made decisions alone and carried the weight of the household by herself. The loneliness of the child evacuated to strangers, who cried into her pillow at night missing her mother's touch, her father's laugh, the familiar sounds and smells of home. But there was also a particular kind of loneliness that came from the inability to share certain experiences or emotions. A soldier who had seen and done things he could never describe to his family, who knew they could not understand, who carried memories he would never be able to fully share. A concentration camp survivor who lived through horrors so extreme that even she herself could barely believe them, let alone explain them to others. A woman who had made compromises to survive occupation, who carried shame she could never voice, because who would understand the impossible position she'd been in? This loneliness of incommunicable experience was particularly isolating, because it meant that even when you were with others, even when you were surrounded by people who loved you, there was a part of you that remained forever separate, locked away, unable to bridge the gap between what you knew and what others could comprehend. This created a kind of existential isolation that many war survivors carried for the rest of their lives. Alongside the fear and grief and loneliness, there was also sometimes guilt, complex and corrosive. Survivor's guilt, the feeling that you had no right to be alive when others had died, that you should have done more to save them, that your survival was somehow purchased at their expense. This guilt was illogical, but it was also powerful and persistent, resistant to reason or reassurance. There was guilt about choices made under duress, about compromises and collaborations, about times when survival required actions that contradicted values and principles. A father who stole food to feed his starving children might be glad his children did not starve, but he might also carry guilt about the stealing for the rest of his life. A woman who testified falsely to save herself might live, but she would have to live with the knowledge of what she had done. There was guilt about normal human reactions to abnormal situations. A mother who sometimes resented her children for needing her when she had nothing left to give. A soldier who felt relief when a comrade was killed instead of him. These feelings were understandable given the circumstances, but they still created guilt, still made people question their own decency and goodness, and there was sometimes guilt about not suffering enough, about having had it easier than others. People who lived through the war in relatively safe locations felt guilty when they heard about the experiences of those who had been in the thick of the fighting, or had lived through occupation, or had been in camps. They felt that their own difficulties were trivial by comparison, that they had no right to complain or to claim to have suffered. This invalidation of their own experiences prevented them from processing and integrating what they had been through. But alongside all of this heavy emotional weight, there were also moments and feelings that sustained people, that gave them reasons to keep going. Hope was sometimes fragile and sometimes seemed foolish, but it persisted nonetheless. Hope that the war would end, that loved ones would come home, that life would return to something like normal. People held on to hope fiercely, cultivating it like a small flame in a strong wind, protecting it from the events and information that threatened to extinguish it. There were small pleasures that took on outsized importance given the context. A cup of real tea, a letter from someone far away, a sunny day after a week of rain, a child's laughter, a flower blooming in the rubble. These small good things became vital, evidence that beauty and joy had not been entirely banished from the world, reminders of what life could be like, what it might be like again someday. There was love, enduring and adapting to the circumstances of war. Couples separated by thousands of miles maintained their connections through letters, through photographs carried close to the heart, through promises made and remembered. New loves began, sometimes urgently, with the knowledge that time might be short, that tomorrow might never come. Parents loved their children with a fierce protective intensity, willing to do anything to keep them safe. Friendships deepened in the crucible of shared hardship, bonds forged that would last lifetimes. There was solidarity, the sense of being all in this together, of shared purpose and shared struggle. In Britain, the Blitz created a spirit of unity across class lines that was unusual for that time and place. In occupied countries, shared resistance to the occupying forces created connections of trust and mutual support. Even in situations of extreme deprivation, people often found ways to help one another, to share what little they had, to maintain their humanity in circumstances that seemed designed to strip it away. And there was resilience, that remarkable human capacity to adapt, to endure, to find ways to keep going even when everything seems impossible. People discovered strengths they had not known they possessed. They learned that they could survive on less sleep, less food, less certainty than they had thought possible. They learned that they could be more afraid than they had ever imagined and still function. They learned that grief did not have to be resolved to be survived, that loneliness did not have to be cured to be endured. This resilience was not unlimited, and it came at a cost. Some people were pushed past their breaking points. Some developed mental health problems that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Some were so changed by their experiences that they could never fully return to ordinary life, could never shake the wartime mode of heightened alert and constant strategizing for survival. But for many, perhaps most, there was a kind of stubborn persistence, a determination not to let the war destroy them completely, to hold on to some core sense of self, to maintain some connection to normalcy and hope and human connection, despite everything that was being thrown at them. This was not heroic in any flashy or dramatic sense. It was quiet and often unglamorous. But it was profound nonetheless. This everyday courage, this decision to keep living, keep caring, keep hoping despite all the reasons not to. The hidden weight on people's minds during World War II thus consisted of a complex mixture of fear and grief, loneliness and guilt, alongside love and hope and resilience and solidarity. These emotions did not stay neatly separated. They mixed and interacted in ways that were often confusing and contradictory. A person could feel grateful to be alive and guilty about surviving, both at the same time. They could feel hopeful about the future and terrified of the present. They could love deeply and also resent the vulnerability that love created. And because there was so little space to acknowledge or process these complex emotions during the war itself, they accumulated, layer upon layer, creating a kind of psychological debt that would come due later. When the war finally ended, people expected to feel simple relief, simple joy. And they did feel those things, but they also felt a great upwelling of all the emotions they had been pushing down for years, all the grief and fear and exhaustion that they had not had time or permission to fully feel when survival required their full attention. The psychological impact of carrying this hidden weight would manifest in various ways in the post-war years. Some people became depressed, struggling to find meaning or motivation in peacetime after years of operating in crisis mode. Some developed what we would now recognize as PTSD, though it was not called that at the time, suffering from nightmares and flashbacks and hypervigilance that did not abate when the actual danger ended. Some had difficulty with intimate relationships, having learned to protect themselves emotionally during the war and finding it hard to be vulnerable again. Some threw themselves into rebuilding with manic energy, trying to outrun their memories, trying to create such a busy, productive life that there would be no time to think about what they had been through. Some turned to alcohol or other substances to numb the pain. Some withdrew from society, unable to relate to people who had not shared their experiences, who could not understand what they had endured. But some also found ways to integrate their wartime experiences, to make meaning from them, to use what they had learned about themselves and about human nature to inform their post-war lives in positive ways. Some became dedicated to peace work, determined to prevent future wars. Some became advocates for veterans or refugees or other vulnerable populations, their own suffering making them compassionate toward others who suffered. Some simply became people who never took ordinary comforts for granted, who appreciated simple pleasures with an intensity born of having lived without them. The hidden weight on people's minds during the war was thus not just a burden, though it certainly was that. It was also a teacher, harsh and demanding, forcing people to confront aspects of themselves and of human existence that they might never have encountered in easier times. It revealed depths of human cruelty and depths of human compassion, often existing side by side. It showed that people were simultaneously more fragile and more resilient than they might have thought, capable of being broken but also capable of bending without breaking, of enduring the seemingly unendurable. And this knowledge, this understanding of the human capacity for both suffering and survival, became part of the legacy that the war generation passed down to those who came after. They taught, sometimes explicitly, but more often through example, that life could be terribly hard, terribly unfair, but that it was still worth living. They taught that love mattered even when it brought pain, that community mattered even when it was difficult, that hope mattered even when it seemed foolish. They taught these lessons not through grand speeches, but through the simple fact of their survival, their persistence, their refusal to be entirely defeated by circumstances that might well have defeated them. Life in the shelters and during the blackout nights of World War II created a particular kind of intimacy and strangeness, a suspension of normal social boundaries and routines that marked people in distinctive ways. When the air raid sirens began their mournful wailing, people would gather up their precious belongings, the small treasures they could not bear to leave behind, and make their way to whatever shelter was available. In London, this often meant the underground stations, where thousands of people would crowd onto the platforms, transforming spaces meant for brief waiting into impromptu communities that would spend entire nights together. The journey to the shelter was its own small drama. People hurrying through darkened streets, forbidden to show lights that might guide enemy bombers, navigating by memory and the faint illumination of a sliver of moon or starlight when the clouds allowed. Children clutching parents' hands, the elderly moving more slowly, helped along by neighbours or strangers. The feeling of vulnerability, of exposure, until finally descending into the relative safety of the underground or the basement or the Anderson shelter in the back garden. Once in the shelter, a strange little society would form. Families would stake out their regular spots, spreading blankets and setting up small lamps if they were allowed, arranging their few possessions. There would be a period of settling in, of making tea from thermoses, of helping children get as comfortable as possible on the hard floors or wooden benches. And then the waiting would begin, the long hours of uncertainty, not knowing if tonight would be a false alarm or if the bombs would fall, not knowing if your home would still be standing when you emerged in the morning. People developed routines to cope with the time and the tension. There was knitting, endless knitting, fingers working automatically on scarves and socks for soldiers, or sweaters for children, or blankets for refugees. There was reading, though the light was poor and eyes grew tired quickly. There was quiet conversation, people talking to pass the time, sharing news and rumours, worries and hopes. There was singing sometimes, old songs that everyone knew, voices joining together to create a small bubble of normalcy and human warmth. The children in the shelters often adapted more readily than the adults, treating the experience as an adventure, at least initially. They would play quiet games, tell each other stories, explore the limited space available to them. But they also absorbed the tension of the adults, and as the nights wore on, as the bombing continued week after week, month after month, the novelty wore off, and they too felt the strain, the exhaustion, the longing to sleep in their own beds, to live normal lives again. The elderly found the shelter life particularly difficult. The hard sleeping surfaces hurt their joints and backs. The cold and damp aggravated their various ailments. The lack of privacy was harder for those raised in more formal times, and the disruption of routines that had been maintained for decades was disorienting. stripping away the small comforts and familiar patterns that made life manageable. The sound of bombs falling above, the rumble and crash of explosions, the shaking of the earth and the raining down of dust and debris from the ceiling created a particular kind of terror. It was different from the fear of combat, where at least you could try to do something, could shoot back or take cover or maneuver. In the shelter, there was nothing to do but sit and wait and hope that the bombs would not hit directly, that the shelter would hold, that you would survive to see another morning. People developed their own ways of coping with this helpless terror. Some prayed, fervently and constantly, finding comfort in the rituals and words they had learned in childhood. Some held hands with loved ones, taking comfort from physical contact, from the solid reality of another human body in the midst of chaos. Some tried to distract themselves, focusing intently on a book or their knitting or a conversation, anything to keep their minds away from thoughts of what might be happening above. Some people could not cope. They broke down, wept uncontrollably, had to be comforted by others even though those others were themselves barely managing. Some developed what might now be called panic disorders, unable to enter shelters without overwhelming anxiety, unable to hear sirens without being flooded with terror. For them, every raid was a fresh crisis, every night a new ordeal of fear that never quite subsided even when the all-clear sounded. The blackout regulations that required all lights to be extinguished or completely concealed after dark transformed the nighttime world in ways that went beyond the practical purpose of denying enemy bombers navigational aids. The darkness was profound and disorienting, especially on moonless or cloudy nights. Streets that people had walked 1,000 times became alien and treacherous. Without streetlights, without the glow from shop windows or the headlights of passing cars, the world became a place of shadows and uncertain shapes, where every step had to be taken carefully, where stumbling and falling were constant risks. The blackout created new social dynamics. Walking home after dark, people would greet strangers more readily, reassured by the sound of a human voice in the darkness, by the confirmation that the shadow moving ahead was indeed another person, and not just a trick of the limited light. Crimes increased during the blackout, petty thefts and assaults made easier by the cover of darkness and the absence of street lighting. But so did acts of kindness, people helping each other navigate, offering arms to steady the elderly or infirm, calling out warnings about obstacles or dangers ahead. The psychological impact of the blackout was significant, though less obvious than the physical challenges it created. The darkness was a reminder of the war every single night, an inescapable sign that normal life was suspended. It created a sense of being cut off, isolated, each household an island in the dark, connected to neighbours and community only by the thin threads of shared experience and mutual aid. The blackout made it harder to maintain optimism, harder to imagine a return to peacetime when even something as simple as a lit window at night had become forbidden. Inside blacked-out homes, families gathered around single candles or carefully shaded lamps, the precious electricity rationed and conserved. The dimness created an atmosphere that was both cosy and oppressive, bringing people physically close together while also creating shadows that hid expressions and emotions. Children did homework by candlelight, learning to conserve their eyesight while still trying to keep up with schooling that was frequently disrupted by raids and evacuations and the general chaos of wartime. The blackout affected people's sleep patterns and circadian rhythms. Going to bed shortly after dark became common, partly to conserve fuel and electricity, partly because there was little to do in the dark, partly as a way to escape from the worry and fear through sleep. But sleep itself was often elusive, disturbed by sirens and the sound of bombers overhead, by worries that crowded in during the quiet dark hours, by bodies and minds that could not quite relax even when they desperately needed rest. The contrast between the enforced darkness of the blackout and the terrible brightness of the fires set by incendiary bombs created a kind of visual whiplash that was deeply unsettling. The night sky would be dark and then suddenly, violently bright with the orange and red of burning buildings, bright enough to read by, bright enough that faces caught in the glare showed every line of fear and exhaustion. This flickering between darkness and terrible light seemed to mirror the psychological state of those living through the bombing, the oscillation between periods of relative calm and moments of acute crisis. For those in the shelters, time took on a strange quality. The hours stretched out, each minute feeling like 10, the night seeming endless. And yet, when the all-clear finally sounded and people emerged into daylight, sometimes it felt like no time had passed at all, like they'd been caught in some pocket outside of normal time. This distortion of temporal experience added to the general sense of unreality, of life being lived in some strange alternate dimension, where the normal rules and patterns no longer applied. The community that formed in the shelters was real, but also temporary and contingent. People formed bonds with those they sheltered with night after night, sharing fears and rations and sometimes their life stories. But these bonds existed in a specific context, and often did not translate well to the daylight world above. People might be intimate in the shelter, sharing vulnerable moments and deep conversations, and then barely acknowledge each other when passing on the street the next day. The shelter community was its own little world with its own social dynamics, separate from but adjacent to the regular community structures. There were unofficial leaders in most shelters, people who naturally took charge, who organized activities or mediated disputes, or kept spirits up with jokes and stories. There were those who provided practical help, sharing tea or biscuits, offering blankets to those who arrived without, checking on the elderly or infirm. There were entertainers, people with voices or instruments who led the singing, or storytellers who could transport listeners away from the present moment into other worlds, other times. These roles emerged organically, filling needs that existed in this forced community. But there was also friction. Crowded conditions and constant stress made people irritable. Small annoyances became major grievances. Someone snoring, a child's constant crying, someone who talked too much or took up more than their share of space. These minor things could become sources of real conflict. The social pressure to maintain morale, to be cheerful and uncomplaining, meant that these irritations often had to be suppressed, adding to the overall burden of tension that people carried. The shelters became places where social hierarchies were both reinforced and challenged. In some shelters, wealth and social position meant little, everyone equal in their vulnerability and their shared need for safety. In others, pre-existing hierarchies were maintained or even strengthened, with better-off families somehow managing to secure more comfortable spots or more resources. The variation depended on the particular people involved, on the leadership or lack thereof, on countless small interactions and choices that added up to a culture unique to each shelter community. The experience of shelter life stayed with people long after the war ended. Many who had spent years sleeping in shelters found it difficult to sleep in ordinary bedrooms afterward, the silence and isolation feeling wrong after so long in crowded, noisy conditions. Some developed claustrophobia, or conversely agoraphobia, the shelters having created associations between safety and enclosure, or between danger and open spaces that persisted for decades. The smell of damp concrete, or the sound of air moving through underground spaces could trigger powerful emotional reactions in shelter survivors, bringing back the fear and the tedium and the strange camaraderie of those long nights. The children who grew up spending their nights in shelters developed particular psychological patterns. They learned to associate nighttime with danger, darkness with fear, in ways that could persist throughout their lives. They learned to sleep lightly, to wake at the slightest unusual sound, a hypervigilance that served them well during the war but became a burden afterward. They learned that safety was communal, that survival depended on being with others, and some found it very difficult to be alone, especially at night, even when the war was long over. But shelter life also taught other lessons. It taught about resilience, about the human capacity to adapt to almost anything given enough time. It taught about community, about how people could come together and support one another even in the worst circumstances. It taught that routine and ritual could provide comfort even in chaos, that small acts of kindness mattered, that humanity could persist even when everything seemed designed to crush it. The shelter experience became a defining memory for millions of people, a touchstone they would return to again and again when trying to explain what the war had been like, what they had endured. "We were in the shelters," they would say, and those 3 words contained multitudes, held within them all the fear and boredom and community and survival that characterized those long nights underground or in basements or in backyard. Anderson shelters, waiting for the bombs to fall or the all clear to sound, living hour by hour, night by night, through a time that tested them in ways they had never imagined, that changed them in ways they would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. Soldiers and the long road home carried burdens that were often invisible to those who had not shared their experiences. When young men and women went off to war, they left behind one version of themselves, and the person who eventually came home, if they came home at all, was someone fundamentally different. The process of this transformation was gradual, made up of countless small moments and choices, but its cumulative effect was profound and often permanent. For soldiers in combat, the experience of sustained danger created changes in how they related to the world. Living for months or years in a state where death might come at any moment altered their sense of what mattered and what did not. The petty concerns that had seemed important before the war, the social anxieties and small embarrassments, faded to nothing when compared to the daily reality of survival. This shift in perspective was useful during the war, but it made returning to civilian life difficult, because the things that everyone else cared about seemed trivial, incomprehensible. A soldier who had survived months of combat might return to his hometown and be expected to care about local gossip, about who was dating whom or what happened at the church social. He would sit at the dinner table listening to family members discuss these things and feel a vast distance opening up between himself and them, a sense that they were speaking different languages, living in different worlds even though they were in the same room. He could not explain to them that these things seemed absurd to him now, that he had seen too much to care about such trivialities. And so he would stay silent, or he would make the appropriate noises, and the distance would grow. The skills that soldiers learned during the war were highly specific to combat situations, and often useless or even counterproductive in civilian life. They had learned to be hypervigilant, constantly scanning for threats, sleeping lightly, ready to wake at the slightest sound. They had learned to make split-second decisions under pressure, to act first and analyze later. They had learned to compartmentalize, to shut down emotions that would interfere with functioning. These abilities served them well in war, but they made peace difficult. hypervigilance did not turn off just because the war had ended. Veterans found themselves unable to relax, constantly on edge, startled by loud noises or sudden movements. They could not sleep through the night, waking at every sound, convinced on some level that danger was imminent even when rationally they knew they were safe. This constant state of arousal was exhausting and interfered with everything: work, relationships, simple enjoyment of life. The compartmentalization that had allowed them to function during combat made it hard to reconnect emotionally with family and friends. They had learned to seal off their feelings, and those seals did not easily break. Wives complained that their husbands seemed distant, cold, unable or unwilling to show affection or express emotion. Children grew up with fathers who were physically present but emotionally unreachable. Men who went through the motions of family life but seemed somehow absent elsewhere. Some veterans dealt with this by throwing themselves into work, staying busy constantly, filling their lives with activity so there was no time or space for the feelings to emerge. Others turned to alcohol, using it to numb the pain and fear that they could not express or address directly. Still others simply withdrew, becoming increasingly isolated, avoiding social situations, spending more and more time alone with their memories and their ghosts. The memories themselves were often fragmentary and intrusive. Veterans would be going about their daily lives when suddenly a smell or a sound or a random sight would trigger a flashback, and they would be back there, in the war, experiencing it as if it were happening again in the present moment. The flashback might last seconds or minutes, but it left them shaken, disoriented, reminded of things they were desperately trying to forget. The nightmares were even worse. Night after night, veterans would relive traumatic events in their sleep, waking up gasping or crying or swinging at enemies who were not there. Their partners learned to wake them carefully, from a distance, knowing that a person woken suddenly from a combat nightmare might lash out before fully waking, might hurt someone they loved without meaning to. Some veterans stopped sleeping in beds with their wives, afraid of what they might do in their sleep, relegated to sleeping alone on couches or in separate rooms. What made all of this harder was that there was very little acknowledgement or support for what we would now call post-traumatic stress. In the 1940s and 1950s, mental health issues carried tremendous stigma. Real men did not have emotional problems, did not need help processing their experiences, were expected to just soldier on, to tough it out, to get over it and move forward with their lives. Veterans who struggled were seen as weak, as lacking in moral fibre, as somehow defective. This lack of understanding and support meant that many veterans suffered in silence, never seeking help, never talking about what they had been through or how it continued to affect them. They internalized the message that their struggles were shameful, that they should be able to handle this on their own, that admitting to difficulty was admitting to weakness. And so they carried their pain alone, and it ate at them from the inside, affecting their health, their relationships, their ability to find meaning and joy in post-war life. Some veterans coped by seeking out other veterans, by spending time with people who had shared similar experiences and who understood without needing explanations. Veterans' organizations provided spaces where men could gather and feel some sense of community and shared understanding. These gatherings often involved drinking, which was its own problem, but they also provided a kind of mutual support, a recognition that everyone there had been through something that outsiders could not fully grasp. The process of adjustment took years, sometimes decades. Veterans learned, slowly and painfully, how to function in civilian life again. They learned to manage their hypervigilance, to recognize when their reactions were disproportionate to actual threat. They learned to find meaningful work that gave them purpose and structure. They learned, some of them, how to reconnect emotionally with their families, how to be present for their children, how to show affection to their wives. But they were never quite the same as they would have been if the war had not happened. The experiences left marks that never fully faded. The memories stayed, growing less vivid perhaps, but never disappearing entirely. The tendency toward hypervigilance persisted, flaring up under stress. The nightmares might become less frequent, but they rarely stopped completely. And there was always the knowledge, buried deep but present, of what they had done and seen, of the things they were capable of, both terrible and brave. For many veterans, there was also a sense of dislocation in time, a feeling that the most important part of their life had been during the war, that everything since was somehow less real, less meaningful. They had been tested and had risen to that test, had faced the ultimate challenges and survived. Civilian life, for all its comforts, could seem pale and shallow by comparison. This made it difficult to invest fully in post-war life, difficult to care deeply about career advancement or social standing or any of the things that were supposed to matter. The veterans who had seen the most combat, who had the most traumatic experiences, sometimes struggled the most with the return to civilian life. But even those who had spent the war in support roles, who had not seen heavy combat, still carried the weight of their wartime experiences. They had left home, had served, had been part of something larger than themselves, and that experience marked them. They too found that they did not quite fit back into the lives they had left behind, that they had changed in ways both obvious and subtle. For women who had served either in military roles or in support capacities, the challenges of coming home had additional dimensions. They had proven to themselves and others that they were capable, competent, able to do demanding work under pressure. They had tasted a kind of independence and responsibility that was not normally available to women in that era. And then they were expected to return to domestic life, to give up the meaningful work they had been doing, to be content with housekeeping and child rearing. Many women veterans struggled with this transition. They missed the sense of purpose and contribution they had felt during the war. They found domestic life constraining after the relative freedom and importance of their wartime roles. Some managed to channel their wartime experiences into post-war careers or volunteer work, finding ways to remain engaged and active. Others felt frustrated and unfulfilled, sensing that they were capable of more than their society would allow them to do. The war had changed expectations and possibilities for women in ways that could not be entirely undone when peace came. The women who had proven themselves during the war carried that knowledge with them, and it shaped how they raised their daughters, what they believed women could and should be allowed to do. The seeds of later feminist movements were planted, in part, by the experiences of women during World War II, by the gap between what they had done during the war and what they were allowed to do afterward. For soldiers who had been prisoners of war, the challenges of coming home were even more complex. They had endured not just the dangers of combat, but also the prolonged trauma of captivity, the malnutrition and disease, the uncertainty about if and when they would be freed, the psychological pressure of interrogation, and the constant threat of harsh punishment for any perceived violation of camp rules. POWs often returned home with severe physical problems, the legacy of years of inadequate food and medical care. But the psychological scars were often deeper and more persistent. They had survived situations of complete powerlessness, where every aspect of their lives was controlled by their captors, where the difference between life and death might depend on the mood of a guard or pure random chance. This experience of utter helplessness created wounds that were difficult to heal. Many former POWs struggled with guilt about their survival, wondering what they had done or failed to do that allowed them to live when others had died. They replayed decisions and moments in their minds, questioning themselves, unable to find peace with the choices they had made under duress. They carried the faces and names of those who had not made it, feeling a responsibility to honor their memory, to make their own survival mean something, to justify the fact that they lived while others did not. The return home for POWs was often complicated by the fact that their families had mourned them as dead or missing, had moved on with their lives in some ways, and then had to adjust to their unexpected return. The POW himself had to adjust to a world that had continued without him, to family members who had changed and grown during his absence, to a home that was familiar but also strange after so long away. Children who had been young when their fathers left for war sometimes did not remember them at all, and the returning POW had to build a relationship with a child who saw him as a stranger. Wives had become independent, had learned to manage households and make decisions alone, and the return of a husband required renegotiating roles and responsibilities. These adjustments were made more difficult by the physical and psychological state of many returning POWs who needed care and support at a time when they also needed to reassert their place in the family. The long road home for soldiers was not a simple journey from war to peace, from trauma to healing. It was a complex, lifelong process of integration and adjustment, of learning to live with what they had experienced and become. Some found ways to thrive, to use their wartime experiences as foundations for meaningful post-war lives. Others struggled constantly, never fully able to shake the weight of what they carried. Most fell somewhere in between, managing to build lives and families and careers while also carrying wounds that never fully healed, memories that never quite faded, changes that could not be undone. And this was not just about individual soldiers, it was about entire societies learning to reintegrate large numbers of traumatized young people, to create structures that could support them or fail them, to understand or misunderstand what they had been through and what they needed. The successes and failures of this reintegration would affect not just the veterans themselves, but their families, their communities, and the larger society for generations to come. The children of traumatized veterans would grow up in homes marked by their father's pain, would learn patterns of relating and coping that reflected wartime experiences they themselves had not directly lived through. The legacy of the war would ripple forward through time in countless ways, some obvious, many subtle, and easily missed. Children growing up in wartime carried their own unique burdens and developed their own particular scars. They experienced the war from a child's perspective, with a child's understanding and a child's vulnerabilities, and these experiences shaped them in ways that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The youngest children, those who were babies or toddlers during the war years, might not have conscious memories of the war itself, but they still carried its effects. They absorbed the stress and fear of their caregivers through countless small interactions. A mother's tension when air raid sirens sounded, a father's absence and the grief it caused, the general atmosphere of worry and scarcity that pervaded households, all of this affected even very young children in ways that might not become apparent until years later. Research in later decades would show that children who grew up in the stressed environments of wartime often developed anxious attachment styles, difficulties with trust and security, heightened stress responses that persisted into adulthood. They might not remember the specific events that created these patterns, but their nervous systems remembered, their early experiences shaping how they related to the world in fundamental ways. Children who were a bit older, in the middle childhood years during the war, did have conscious memories, and these memories were often confused and frightening. They remember the sound of sirens, the nights in shelters, the sight of destruction in the morning. They remembered rationing and hunger, the constant awareness that there was not enough of things that had once been taken for granted. They remembered adults being worried and distracted, not always available to provide the attention and reassurance that children need. Many of these children developed what might now be recognized as anxiety disorders. They had trouble sleeping, plagued by nightmares of bombs and destruction. They developed nervous habits, nail-biting or hair-pulling or compulsive behaviors that served as outlets for the anxiety they carried. They had difficulty concentrating in school, their minds wandering to worries about their fathers at the front or their mothers at work in dangerous factories, or simply about whether there would be enough to eat. The evacuated children, those who were sent away from cities to live in the countryside with strangers, faced particular challenges. The initial separation was often traumatic, standing on train platforms saying goodbye to crying mothers, not understanding why they were being sent away, fearing that they had done something wrong to deserve this exile. The journey itself was often chaotic and frightening. Children herded onto trains with labels pinned to their coats, travelling to unknown destinations with unknown futures. Arrival in the countryside meant being paraded in front of local families who would choose which children to take, an experience that left many children feeling rejected and worthless when they were not chosen first, or when they were chosen only reluctantly. The families who took them in varied enormously in their kindness and capability. Some children were lucky and ended up with families who treated them well, who made them feel welcome and loved. Others were less fortunate, placed with families who saw them as burdens, who used them for labour, who were cold or actively cruel. Even in good placements, evacuated children struggled with the loss of their families and their familiar lives. They missed their parents terribly, crying themselves to sleep at night, counting the days until they might be allowed to go home. They received letters that took on enormous importance, reading them over and over, treasuring every word, trying to hold on to the connection with their families across the distance and the weeks between letters. The children who remained in cities and lived through the bombing had different challenges. They learned to function on interrupted sleep, to cope with constant fear, to accept that the world was a dangerous and unpredictable place. They became familiar with death and destruction in ways that no child should, seeing the aftermath of bomb strikes, knowing classmates who had been killed, living with the constant possibility that they themselves might die at any moment. These children often grew up faster than they should have, taking on adult responsibilities out of necessity. Older siblings cared for younger ones when parents were working or dealing with emergencies. Children as young as 8 or 10 might be responsible for managing ration books, standing in queues, preparing meals, all while also trying to keep up with schoolwork and maintain some semblance of childhood. The war disrupted education in countless ways. Schools were bombed and had to close or relocate. Teachers were called up for military service or war work, leaving classrooms understaffed and overcrowded. Evacuated children often ended up in schools where they were behind or ahead of the local curriculum, where they were teased for their city accents or their lack of familiarity with country ways. In cities, education was frequently interrupted by air raids, by the need to shelter, by the general chaos of wartime existence. Many children fell behind academically during the war years, gaps in their education that would affect their future prospects and opportunities. But they also learned things that were not part of any curriculum, lessons about survival and resilience, about the capacity for human kindness and human cruelty, about the fragility of safety, and the impermanence of the familiar world. Children's play during the war often reflected and processed their experiences in ways that were both healthy and troubling. They played war games, reenacting battles, taking roles as soldiers or civilians or even as the enemy. This kind of play was normal, a way for children to make sense of what was happening around them, to feel some sense of control by acting out scenarios in miniature. But it also revealed the degree to which violence and conflict had become normalized in children's worlds, the way that war had infiltrated even the imaginative play that should have been a respite from harsh realities. Children collected shrapnel and bits of destroyed buildings the way children in peacetime might collect stamps or baseball cards. They knew the names and specifications of different aircraft, could identify them by sound alone, took pride in this knowledge that was both fascinating and frightening. They developed elaborate systems for trading their war-related treasures, creating economies and hierarchies based on the availability and desirability of different pieces of shrapnel or different bomb fragments. The relationship between children and their parents was affected in complex ways by the war. Fathers who went off to fight became increasingly distant figures, known more through photographs and letters than through daily interaction. Children idealized these absent fathers, imagining them as heroes, struggling to reconcile the real, flawed human being with the perfect father of their imagination when or if the man actually returned. Mothers who took on multiple roles, working in factories or serving in civil defense while also trying to maintain households and raise children alone, were often exhausted and stretched beyond their limits. They had less patience and less emotional availability than they would have in peacetime, less time for the small attentions and affections that help children feel secure and loved. This was not their fault. They were doing their best under impossible circumstances, but it still affected the children, who internalized the sense that they should not be too demanding, should not add to their mother's burdens, should be good and quiet and not cause problems. This learned self-sufficiency and suppression of needs could serve children well in some ways, making them independent and capable. But it could also create difficulties in forming healthy adult relationships, in learning to ask for help or to acknowledge vulnerability, in believing that their needs and feelings mattered and deserved attention. Children who lost parents during the war faced grief that was complicated by their developmental stage and by the circumstances of wartime. A child who lost a father to combat might struggle with complicated feelings, grief mixed with pride in his sacrifice, guilt about any negative feelings toward him, confusion about what death meant and where the father had gone. The rituals that normally help with grieving might be unavailable or truncated, the body never recovered, the funeral a hurried affair or impossible to attend. Children who lost mothers, whether to bombing or disease or the various hazards of wartime existence, faced even more profound dislocations. Mothers were typically the primary caregivers, the centers of children's emotional worlds, and losing that central figure was devastating. Children who lost mothers often ended up scattered among relatives or in institutional care, their lives completely upended, their sense of security and belonging shattered in ways that were very difficult to repair. The children who grew up during World War II became the adults who built the post-war world, and they carried their wartime experiences with them into that work. They had learned about scarcity and valued abundance and security in ways that shaped consumer culture and economic policy. They had learned about the dangers of unchecked aggression and valued institutions that might prevent future wars. They had learned about the importance of community and mutual support and built systems, imperfect as they were, meant to provide safety nets and social protections. But they also carried wounds that affected how they parented their own children, how they related to authority and institutions, how they understood the world and their place in it. Some became overprotective parents, unable to let their own children take normal risks because they knew too well how quickly safety could turn to disaster. Others became emotionally distant, repeating patterns they had learned during the war, unable to provide the warmth and connection their children needed. The children of World War II became a generation marked by particular characteristics, resilience and self-reliance, but also often anxiety and difficulty with emotional expression, a deep valuing of stability and security, but also sometimes a tendency toward materialism as compensation for early deprivation. Like their parents, they were shaped by the war in ways both obvious and subtle, ways that rippled forward through their lives and into the lives of their own children and grandchildren. The war created what would later be called intergenerational trauma, patterns of coping and relating that were passed down not through conscious teaching, but through the countless small interactions between parents and children, through the emotional atmospheres of homes, through what was said and left unsaid, through the wounds that parents carried and that affected how they showed up for their children. Understanding these patterns would take decades of research and reflection, but the effects were real from the beginning, affecting families and communities in ways that would only gradually come to be understood. And now we come to the long middle section of our story, the part where we explore dozens of additional aspects of what getting through World War II did to people, the countless small and large ways that those years of conflict and hardship marked the millions who lived through them. There was the matter of food and hunger, which touched everyone but affected people differently depending on their circumstances. In Britain, the rationing system was relatively fair and comprehensive, ensuring that everyone had at least minimal nutrition even if it was monotonous and barely sufficient. People learned to make do with less, to stretch ingredients, to appreciate small luxuries like an egg or a piece of chocolate that would have been taken for granted before the war. The mental space that food scarcity occupied was significant. Women, who typically did the household cooking, spent enormous amounts of time and energy trying to provide adequate meals from inadequate resources. They swapped recipes for wartime dishes, ways to make cakes without eggs or meat pies without much meat, ways to make food that would fill bellies and provide at least some nutrition, and ideally taste like something other than poverty and deprivation. The psychological impact of chronic mild hunger was subtle but real. It made people irritable and tired, reduced their ability to concentrate, affected their immune systems, making them more vulnerable to disease. Children who grew up malnourished during the war years often had lasting health effects, not dramatically stunted but subtly affected in ways that might only show up in later life, in earlier aging or increased vulnerability to certain conditions. In other parts of Europe and Asia, hunger was more severe, crossing the line from deprivation into actual starvation. In besieged cities like Leningrad, people ate things that would have been unthinkable in normal times, not just all the pets and rats, but also tree bark and wallpaper paste. Anything that might provide a few calories, anything that might keep them alive one more day. The desperation of true starvation pushed people to extremes, broke down social norms and moral boundaries in ways that left those who survived carrying terrible memories and terrible guilt. The experience of extreme hunger changed people's relationship with food for the rest of their lives. Survivors of famine could never quite trust that food would be available, hoarded it compulsively even decades later when they had plenty, could never throw away even the smallest scrap. They ate quickly, protectively, with an intensity that reflected memories of times when food was precious and scarce, and you never knew when you might eat again. There was the question of work and purpose, particularly for women who entered the workforce in massive numbers during the war. Women worked in munitions factories, in agriculture, in transport, in countless roles that had previously been reserved for men. They discovered that they were capable of work they had never imagined doing, that they could operate complex machinery, manage difficult tasks, contribute meaningfully to the war effort. This discovery was empowering in many ways. Women gained confidence in their own capabilities, developed skills and expertise, earned their own money, and with it a degree of financial independence they might never have had otherwise. They formed strong bonds with co-workers, friendships forged in shared purpose and shared difficulty. They felt that they were contributing, that their work mattered, that they were part of something larger than themselves. But the work was often dangerous and always exhausting. Munitions work exposed women to toxic chemicals that could cause illness and even death. Long hours in factories with inadequate safety measures led to accidents and injuries. The combination of factory work and household responsibilities meant that many women were chronically sleep-deprived and exhausted, running themselves into the ground trying to do everything that was asked of them. When the war ended and men returned from military service, women were expected to give up their jobs and return to domestic life. This transition was difficult for many. They had proven to themselves and to society that they were capable of more than housework, and it was hard to be told that their contributions were no longer needed, that their place was back in the home. Some women went willingly, exhausted from the demands of the war years and ready for a chance to focus on family. But others felt frustrated and diminished, robbed of purpose and contribution, relegated to roles that felt small and insignificant after the important work they had done during the war. The cultural message to women after the war was contradictory and confusing. On one hand, they were praised for their wartime contributions, told they had been heroic and essential. On the other hand, they were told that the truly important role for women was as wives and mothers, that they should be content with domestic life, that wanting anything more was selfish or unfeminine. This created psychological conflict for many women, a sense of having been used and then discarded, of having proven themselves only to have that proof dismissed or ignored. There was the matter of trust and social cohesion, which was strained in various ways depending on circumstances. In occupied countries, trust became complicated and dangerous. Neighbours might be informants. Casual comments might be reported to authorities. People who seemed friendly might be working for the occupiers. This atmosphere of suspicion and fear affected social relationships profoundly, making people careful and guarded, changing the nature of community life. Even after liberation, the suspicion lingered. Those who had collaborated with occupying forces, or who were suspected of collaboration, faced ostracism or worse. Women who had relationships with enemy soldiers had their heads shaved and were paraded through streets as objects of scorn. People who had made accommodations with the occupiers to survive found themselves judged harshly by those who felt they should have resisted more, suffered more, risked more. The division between resistors and collaborators, or between those perceived as resistors and those perceived as collaborators, created rifts in communities that lasted for generations. Families were divided, friendships ended. The question of who had behaved well and who had behaved badly during the occupation was endlessly debated and never satisfactorily resolved, because the situations people had faced were complex and the choices were often impossible, and judging from the safety of hindsight was easier than living through the reality had been. In countries that were not occupied but were at war, trust was strained in different ways. The need for secrecy about military movements and strategic information created a culture of not asking questions, of accepting that there were things you were not supposed to know. The censorship of mail and media meant that information was controlled and filtered, that people could not always know or speak the truth about what was happening. This culture of secrecy and control had psychological effects that persisted after the war. People had learned not to question authority, not to demand transparency, to accept that some things were kept hidden for the greater good. This could be useful in maintaining social cohesion during crisis, but it could also be problematic in peacetime, creating populations that were perhaps too trusting of government, too willing to accept official narratives, too reluctant to demand accountability. There was the phenomenon of displaced persons, millions of people who'd been uprooted by the war and could not or would not return to their homes. Refugees and concentration camp survivors, forced labourers and prisoners of war, people whose cities or countries had ceased to exist or had become uninhabitable, or had fallen under regimes they could not live under, all these people wandered through post-war Europe seeking safety, seeking lost family members, seeking some place they might be able to build new lives. The experience of being a displaced person was profoundly disorienting. These were people who had lost not just homes but homelands, not just possessions but identities. They had been stripped of the roles and relationships that had defined them, reduced to being refugees, anonymous, unwanted, burdensome. They lived in camps or temporary shelters, dependent on relief organisations, waiting for someone to decide their fate, to grant them entry to some country that might accept them, or to send them back to places they could not safely return to. The psychological toll of this prolonged uncertainty and powerlessness was severe. Displaced persons developed depression and anxiety at high rates. They struggled with feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness. They had trouble forming plans or imagining futures when everything about their present situation was temporary and beyond their control, and they carried trauma from whatever experiences had made them refugees in the first place. Trauma that went untreated and unaddressed because the priority was simply survival, not healing, for those displaced persons who eventually found new homes, whether in the United States or Canada or Australia or Palestine or elsewhere. The process of integration was difficult. They had to learn new languages, new customs, new ways of being in the world. They had to build lives from nothing, often with no money, no connections, no support systems beyond what refugee organisations could provide. They carried their losses with them, mourning for dead family members, for lost homes, for the lives they had expected to live but that had been taken from them. The children of displaced persons grew up with particular burdens. They absorbed their parents' trauma, grew up in households marked by grief and loss, and the struggle to adapt. They often served as bridges between their parents and the new culture, translating both language and customs, mediating between the old world their parents came from and the new world they were trying to join. This parentification of children, making them take on adult responsibilities before they were ready, had costs that might not become apparent until later. But there was also resilience in these displaced communities. People who had survived the worst that could happen to them had a kind of strength born of endurance. They built new lives with determination and creativity, starting businesses, raising families, contributing to their new countries in countless ways. They passed on to their children values of education and hard work, of appreciating opportunities, of never taking safety and security for granted. There was the matter of medical and scientific advances that came out of the war, developments that saved countless lives but that came at terrible human costs. Advances in surgery and trauma care came from treating the endless stream of wounded soldiers, Advances in understanding infection and disease came from the crowded, unsanitary conditions of war. Advances in understanding psychology and trauma came from treating the psychological casualties of combat. Some of these advances came from ethical research and treatment of patients, but some came from horrific experiments conducted in concentration camps and on prisoners, research that violated every principle of medical ethics, that treated human beings as disposable subjects for torture disguised as science. The knowledge gained from these experiments raised profound ethical questions that the medical community would struggle with for decades. Could you use knowledge that had been acquired through such terrible means? Did using it honor or dishonor the victims? There were no easy answers. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki introduced nuclear weapons into the world, creating a new existential threat that would shape the rest of the 20th century and beyond. The survivors of these bombings, the Hibakusha, carried unique traumas. They had witnessed destruction on a scale previously unimaginable, had seen tens of thousands of people killed in instants, had survived when so many had not, and carried the guilt and grief of that survival. But they also carried radiation in their bodies, suffering from increased rates of cancer and other illnesses, living with the fear that they were literally poisoned, that the effects might show up years or decades later, that they might pass damaged genes to their children. The psychological burden of this uncertainty was immense, and it was compounded by social stigma. Other Japanese people sometimes avoided Hibakusha, feared them, believed they were contagious or cursed. So the survivors carried not just their own trauma, but also the weight of others' fear and rejection. There was the matter of moral injury, a concept that would not be named or widely recognized until many decades after the war, but that affected countless people. Moral injury occurs when someone does or witnesses something that violates their deep moral beliefs, when they are forced by circumstances to act in ways that contradict their values, or when they fail to prevent violations of ethics and human decency. Soldiers who killed in combat, even when that killing was justified by the rules of war, often struggled with moral injury. They had taken human lives, had ended other people's stories, had created widows and orphans. The fact that they had done so as part of legitimate military operations did not necessarily make them feel less guilty, less troubled by what they had done. Civilians who had been forced to make impossible choices during the occupation, who had informed on others to save themselves or their families, who had stood by while atrocities were committed because intervening would have meant their own deaths. These people too suffered from moral injury. They knew they had fallen short of who they wanted to be, had failed to live up to their own standards of behavior, and this knowledge was corrosive and painful. The process of healing from moral injury was difficult and often incomplete. It required accepting that you were imperfect, that you had done things you regretted, that you would have to live with that knowledge for the rest of your life. It required finding some way to make meaning from your actions, to contribute positively to the world in ways that might balance out the harm you had caused or failed to prevent. Some people managed this, others never could, carrying guilt and shame that poisoned their lives and relationships for decades. There was the phenomenon of war brides, women from Europe and Asia who married Allied soldiers and emigrated to their husbands' home countries after the war. These women faced unique challenges, leaving behind their families and cultures to start new lives in foreign countries where they often did not speak the language and did not understand the customs. The marriages themselves were often hasty, formed in the intensity of wartime when everything felt urgent and tomorrow was not guaranteed. When the war ended and the couples tried to build ordinary lives together, they sometimes found that they did not actually know each other very well. that the attraction that had seemed so powerful in wartime did not translate well to peacetime domesticity. War brides often faced isolation and loneliness in their new homes. They missed their families terribly, and communication was difficult and expensive, letters taking weeks to arrive and phone calls being prohibitively costly. They struggled to make friends in communities where they were seen as foreigners, where their accents marked them as different, where they did not understand the subtle social rules and often inadvertently violated them. Some war brides were welcomed by their husbands' families and communities, embraced and helped to integrate. Others faced suspicion and hostility, were blamed for taking away someone's son or brother, were treated as gold diggers, or worse. The variation depended on countless factors, the particular people involved, the communities they joined, the times and circumstances. For war brides from former enemy nations, particularly Japan and Germany, the challenges were even greater. They faced not just the normal difficulties of immigration and cultural adaptation, but also the prejudice and anger that their new communities felt toward the countries they came from. They had to navigate the complex position of being simultaneously victims of their own country's aggression and representatives of enemy nations in the eyes of their new neighbours. The children of war brides often grew up caught between cultures, not fully belonging to either their mother's country of origin or their father's homeland. They might speak their mother's language at home but English in school, might celebrate different holidays, might eat different foods. This bicultural experience could be enriching, giving them access to multiple perspectives and traditions. But it could also be confusing and isolating, making them feel like perpetual outsiders, never quite fitting in anywhere. There was the experience of former prisoners of war from the Axis powers, millions of German, Italian and Japanese soldiers who were held in camps by the Allies after the war ended. Their experiences varied widely depending on which country held them and under what conditions. Some were held in reasonable conditions and released relatively quickly. Others were held for years in harsh circumstances, used as forced labour, suffered deprivation and mistreatment. The German and Japanese POWs who were held by the Soviet Union faced particularly brutal conditions. Many did not survive the camps. Those who did often returned home years after the war ended, to families who had mourned them as dead, to countries that had been utterly transformed by defeat and occupation. Their reintegration was complicated by the length of their absence, by the physical and psychological damage they had sustained, by the difficulty of explaining to those who had not been there what they had endured. The psychological impact of prolonged captivity was profound. Like the Allied POWs, they struggled with the loss of agency, the arbitrary cruelty, the uncertainty about their futures. But they also had to grapple with the fact that they had fought for regimes that had committed terrible atrocities, that their countries had been the aggressors, that their side had lost and been found guilty of crimes against humanity. This added layers of complexity to their trauma, guilt about what their nations had done mixing with their own suffering as prisoners. There was the matter of children born of war, products of relationships between occupying soldiers and local women. In many cases, these children were conceived through rape or coercion, though some were the result of genuine relationships, genuine love even, between people on opposite sides of the conflict. Regardless of how they were conceived, these children often faced difficult lives. In countries that had been occupied by Germany, children fathered by German soldiers were often treated terribly. They were seen as products of collaboration, as living reminders of the occupation and its humiliations. Their mothers were punished and ostracized, and the children themselves were sometimes abused or neglected, blamed for circumstances they had no part in creating. In Japan, children fathered by American soldiers faced similar stigma. Mixed-race children stood out visibly in a homogeneous society, were often bullied and excluded, had difficulty finding acceptance or belonging. Some were placed in orphanages or given up for adoption to American families, severing their connection to their Japanese heritage. These children grew up with complex identities and often painful questions about their origins. Who were their fathers? Did they love their mothers, or had it been rape? Why had they been left behind? What did it mean to be the child of enemy soldiers, to carry in your very existence a reminder of war and occupation? For those who sought to understand their origins, to find their fathers or learn about them, the search was often disappointing or painful. Records were incomplete or non-existent. Fathers who could be located sometimes wanted nothing to do with their wartime children, had built new lives and families and saw these children from the war as complications or embarrassments. The children were left with incomplete stories, with more questions than answers, with the knowledge that they were born from violence and chaos into a world that did not want them. There was the matter of survivors of the Holocaust, liberators finding them in camps reduced to walking skeletons, beyond belief that humans could do this to other humans, that this level of systematic cruelty and murder could have been organized and implemented. The survivors faced an impossible task trying to rebuild lives when everything and everyone they had known was gone, when they carried in their bodies and minds the evidence of unspeakable trauma. Many survivors could not or would not talk about what they had endured. The memories were too painful, too horrific. They worried that no one would believe them, that the truth was too extreme to be believable. They felt that people who had not been there could not possibly understand, that there was an unbridgeable gap between their experience and the experience of anyone who had not endured the camps. This silence about the Holocaust was widespread in the immediate post-war years. Survivors wanted to move forward, to build new lives, not to dwell on the past. Society encouraged this, wanted to turn to the future, to rebuild, not to examine too closely the terrible things that had happened. It would take decades before the Holocaust began to be widely discussed and memorialized, before survivors felt able or willing to testify about their experiences, before the scope and horror of it became part of collective memory and understanding. But the silence did not mean healing. Survivors carried their trauma whether they spoke of it or not. They had nightmares and flashbacks. They struggled with depression and anxiety. They had difficulty trusting people, difficulty forming attachments, difficulty believing in any kind of security or safety. Their children grew up in homes marked by unspoken grief and trauma, picking up on their parents' pain even when it was never directly discussed. There was the matter of collaboration and resistance, questions that would haunt occupied countries for decades. Who had collaborated and who had resisted? How should those who had collaborated be punished? How should those who had resisted be honoured? These questions were not simple, because the situations people had faced during the occupation were complex, and the choices they made were often ambiguous. Some people clearly collaborated, actively helping the occupying forces, betraying their neighbours, participating in atrocities. These people faced justice, or at least retribution, in the period immediately after liberation, though the processes were often hasty and driven by emotion rather than careful consideration of evidence and circumstances. But many other cases fell into greyer areas. People who had continued to work in their jobs under occupation, who had served in local administration or police forces, who had made decisions that could be interpreted as either necessary accommodations or unacceptable compromises. How should these people be judged? What degree of cooperation was necessary for survival, and what degree crossed into betrayal? The debates about collaboration and resistance were painful and divisive. They set communities against themselves, created lasting enmities, prevented the kind of social cohesion that was needed for reconstruction and healing. In some countries, these debates continued for generations, with each generation re-examining what their grandparents had done or failed to do during the occupation, sometimes reaching different conclusions, sometimes repeating the same arguments with the same lack of resolution. The resistance fighters, those who had actively opposed the occupation through sabotage, intelligence gathering, helping refugees escape, faced their own challenges after the war. They had lived for years in a heightened state of danger and purpose. The end of the war meant the end of their mission, and many found peacetime life anticlimactic and unsatisfying. They had developed skills and ways of being that were no longer needed or useful. They had formed intense bonds with their fellow resistance members, and these bonds often did not translate well to ordinary social relationships. Some former resistance fighters struggled with the transition to peacetime, became involved in various causes or movements, seeking the sense of purpose and excitement they had experienced during the war. Others simply felt adrift, unable to find meaning in civilian life, haunted by memories of comrades who had been caught and killed, by the close calls and narrow escapes, by the constant danger that had been their normal for so long. There was the matter of widows and orphans, millions of them created by the war. Women whose husbands had been killed faced the practical challenges of supporting themselves and their children without the primary breadwinner, in a society that often provided limited opportunities for women to earn adequate incomes. But they also faced grief and loneliness, the loss of their life partners, the need to raise children alone while also processing their own sorrow. The social status of widows was ambiguous. They were to be pitied for their losses, but also sometimes viewed with suspicion or as threats. Married women worried that widows might try to attract their husbands. Young widows who wanted to remarry and build new lives faced judgment from those who thought they should remain faithful to the memory of their dead husbands indefinitely. Children who lost fathers had to grow up without that presence and influence, without the support and guidance and love that a father would have provided. Many carried idealized images of their dead fathers, fathers who were frozen in time as young men, who never aged or became flawed or complicated in the way that living parents do. This idealization could create problems, making it difficult for children to accept stepfathers if their mothers remarried, creating impossible standards against which real, living people could never measure up. There was the matter of medical personnel, doctors and nurses who had treated the endless stream of wounded and dying during the war. They had seen terrible injuries, had done what they could with limited resources, had held the hands of dying young men who cried for their mothers, had written letters to families trying to offer some comfort, even when there was no comfort to be given. The psychological toll on medical personnel was severe. They developed what we would now call compassion fatigue, a kind of emotional exhaustion that came from caring for too many people in too much pain for too long. They had to harden themselves emotionally to function, to shut down their natural empathy in order to get through each day, and this hardening sometimes became permanent, affecting their ability to be emotionally present in their personal relationships after the war. Many doctors and nurses struggled with guilt about the patients they had not been able to save, about decisions they had made in triage situations where resources were scarce and choices were terrible. They replayed these decisions endlessly in their minds, wondering if they had done the right thing, knowing that their choices had determined who lived and who died. The technical skills and medical knowledge gained during the war were valuable, and many medical personnel built successful careers in the post-war years. But the human cost of acquiring that knowledge, The things they had seen and done and been unable to prevent stayed with them, informing their practice in ways both positive and troubling. There was the experience of factory workers in war industries, particularly those who worked with dangerous materials or in dangerous conditions. Munitions workers handled explosives and toxic chemicals, working long hours in factories where accidents could be catastrophic. Some died in explosions or from exposure to poisons. Others survived but with health problems that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Damaged lungs or livers or reproductive systems, increased cancer risks. The psychological impact of knowing that the products you made were designed to kill was variable. Some workers felt proud to be contributing to the war effort, believed that their work was helping to defend their country or defeat evil. Others struggled with the moral implications, with the knowledge that the shells or bombs or bullets they produced would end human lives. They compartmentalized, told themselves that they were just workers doing a job, that the moral responsibility lay with others. But the knowledge was still there, and for some it was troubling. Women who worked in munitions factories faced particular health risks related to their reproductive systems. The toxic chemicals they handled could cause birth defects or stillbirths if they became pregnant. Some women who had worked in munitions during the war struggled to have healthy pregnancies afterward, lived with guilt about babies that were born with problems or that did not survive, wondering if their wartime work had caused the losses. There was the matter of language and the way it changed during and after the war. New words entered common usage, terms from military life that seeped into civilian vocabulary. People talked about the enemy, about the front, about mobilization and deployment, using martial language for civilian situations. The war had shaped not just the physical world, but also the linguistic landscape, the words people used to describe and understand their experiences. The propaganda of wartime, the way language was used to shape perceptions and maintain morale, created lasting cynicism about official communications. People had learned to read between the lines, to question official narratives, to recognize when they were being manipulated through language. This skepticism could be healthy, encouraging critical thinking and resistance to authoritarianism. But it could also breed a corrosive cynicism that made it difficult to trust any institutions or authorities. There was the matter of material culture, the objects that people saved from the war years and that carried memories and meanings. A ration book kept as a reminder of hardship and endurance. A uniform carefully preserved in a closet. Letters tied with ribbon, read and reread, until the creases threatened to tear through the paper. Photographs of people in their youth, before the war changed everything. Smiling faces frozen in time before the knowledge of what was coming. These objects became precious relics, tangible connections to the past, to people who had died or changed, to a world that no longer existed. They were shown to children and grandchildren, used to tell stories, to try to explain what it had been like, what that generation had endured. But objects could only convey so much. They were traces, remnants, insufficient to fully communicate the reality of lived experience, but precious nonetheless as the best available connection to that vanished time. And finally, in the years and decades after the war ended, there was the slow process of memory and commemoration, of societies trying to come to terms with what had happened, to honour the dead, to make meaning from the suffering. Memorials were built, days of remembrance established, rituals created to mark and memorialize what had been lost. But memory was complicated and contested. Different groups remembered different things, emphasized different aspects of the war. Veterans remembered the camaraderie and the sense of purpose alongside the horror and loss. Civilians remembered the bombing and the rationing and the fear. Survivors of atrocities remembered things that others could barely stand to hear about. Each group's memory was valid and important, but they did not always align, did not always create a coherent collective memory. The process of remembering was also a process of forgetting, of choosing what to emphasize and what to leave out, what to commemorate and what to bury. Some experiences and perspectives were centered in collective memory, while others were marginalized or ignored. The stories that got told shaped how later generations understood the war, but they were always incomplete, always filtered through the needs and biases of the present. And through all of this, through all these varied experiences and impacts, what remained constant was the human dimension. The fact that this vast historical event was experienced by millions of individual people, each with their own story, their own pain and resilience, their own ways of coping and surviving and trying to build lives in the aftermath. The war did something to all of them, changed them in ways large and small, obvious and subtle. It shaped who they were and who their children and grandchildren would be, rippling forward through time in countless ways. The quiet strength that emerged from these years of endurance was real, but it came at a cost. The resilience was genuine, but it was built on foundations of pain and loss that never fully healed. The lessons learned were valuable, but they were learned in the hardest possible way, through suffering and sacrifice that no one would willingly choose to repeat. And so, we come to the conclusion of this long story, this exploration of what getting through World War II actually did to people. We have travelled together through the daily struggles and hidden fears, through the nights in shelters and the long roads home, through the experiences of children and soldiers and workers and refugees and all the countless others who lived through those years. What we have seen is that the war left marks on everyone it touched, marks that were sometimes visible but more often hidden, carried silently through the rest of their lives. We have seen that the human spirit is both more resilient and more fragile than we might imagine, capable of enduring terrible things but not without cost, not without scars that shape and define us. The people who lived through World War II carried forward into peacetime the knowledge they had gained about human nature, about what people are capable of doing to each other, about the fragility of civilization and the persistence of cruelty. But they also carried forward knowledge about human kindness and courage, about the capacity for self-sacrifice and mutual aid, about the small acts of goodness that can shine like lights in the darkest times. They taught their children and grandchildren, sometimes explicitly but more often through example, through the patterns and choices and values they embodied, that life could be terribly hard but was still worth living. That community mattered, that hope mattered, that love mattered even when it brought pain. They taught that ordinary people could endure extraordinary things, that survival itself was a kind of victory, that keeping going was a form of resistance against the forces that sought to destroy and diminish. The world that emerged from the war was shaped by the experiences of those who lived through it, by their determination to prevent future wars, to build systems that would provide security and support, to create a better world for their children than the one they had known. They did not always succeed in these goals. New wars came, new injustices emerged. The world they built was imperfect and flawed, but their efforts, informed by their wartime experiences, mattered nonetheless. And the story continues because the effects of the war did not end with the generation that experienced it directly. The children of those who lived through the war absorbed its impacts through their parents' behaviors and beliefs, through family stories and silences, through the patterns of relating and coping that were passed down. And those children passed something on to their children, a transmission of trauma and resilience both, each generation processing and reprocessing what the war had meant, what it still meant, how it continued to shape them decades and generations removed from the actual events. So what did getting through World War II actually do to people? It broke some and strengthened others, and did both to most, simultaneously and paradoxically. It took away innocence and safety, and the comfort of believing the world was fundamentally orderly and fair. It gave terrible knowledge about human capacity for evil, and also beautiful knowledge about human capacity for courage and compassion. It created wounds that never fully healed, and also strengths that persisted across lifetimes. The war asked more of people than should ever be asked, took more than should ever be taken, but they endured, they survived, they found ways to keep living, keep loving, keep hoping even when hope seemed foolish. They rebuilt their lives and their world, imperfectly but really, carrying forward the lessons and the scars, the strength and the vulnerability, all of it together, all of it part of what it meant to be human, to survive, to remember. And their quiet strength still echoes down through the years, still shapes our world, still teaches us about what humans can endure and what we must never forget, about the terrible things that can happen when we fail to protect each other, and the beautiful things that can emerge when we choose compassion over cruelty, connection over division, hope over despair. The people who got through World War II taught us these lessons not through words but through their lives, through their survival, through their refusal to be entirely defeated even when everything seemed lost. And that teaching continues, generation after generation, a legacy of endurance and humanity passed down through time, precious and painful both, a gift born of suffering that we must honour by never forgetting, by never allowing such suffering to happen again, by holding on to the hope and the kindness and the strength that they showed us was possible even in the darkest times. The immediate aftermath of the war brought a peculiar mixture of euphoria and exhaustion, of celebration shadowed by grief, of relief complicated by uncertainty about what came next. When the fighting finally ended in Europe in May of 1945, there were spontaneous celebrations in the streets, people pouring out of their homes to dance and sing and embrace strangers, the pent-up tension of years finally released in explosions of joy. But even in the midst of celebration, there was sorrow for those who had not lived to see this day, whose empty chairs at the table served as silent reminders of the cost of victory. The end of the war in the Pacific in August 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, brought a different quality of relief. The knowledge of what those weapons had done, the scale of instant destruction they had caused, created a shadow over the celebrations. People were glad the war was over, but troubled by the means of its ending, by the opening of a new era in which such weapons existed and might be used again. The demobilization process, bringing millions of soldiers home from theatres of war around the world, was a massive logistical undertaking, but it was also a human and social challenge. The men and women who returned had been changed by their experiences, and the homes they returned to had changed as well. Nothing was quite as anyone remembered or expected it to be. The reunions that should have been joyful were often awkward, marked by the years of separation, by the gulf between what had been experienced and what could be communicated. Families had to learn to live together again, to renegotiate roles and relationships that had been frozen in time when the person left, and that now had to be thawed and reshaped. Children who barely remembered their fathers had to adjust to the presence of strangers in their homes. Wives who had become independent and self-sufficient had to make space for husbands who wanted to resume their roles as the heads of households, but who brought with them trauma and troubles that affected everyone around them. The rebuilding of destroyed cities became a massive project that would take decades. Some cities had been so thoroughly destroyed that they had to be almost entirely reconstructed. The process of rebuilding was not just practical and physical, it was also psychological and symbolic, a way of asserting that civilization would continue, that destruction did not have the last word. The passage of time brought both healing and new understanding of the war's impacts. Veterans who had struggled to speak about their experiences sometimes found their voices in old age, wanting to pass on what they had learned before it was too late. Holocaust survivors who had maintained silence for decades began to give testimony, wanting to ensure that the world would never forget what had happened. The children and grandchildren of those who lived through the war absorbed its impacts in complex ways, carrying forward patterns of behavior and belief that reflected their parents' and grandparents' experiences, even though they had not directly lived through the war themselves. The trauma was transmitted, but so was the resilience, the values, the understanding of what really mattered in life. As the decades passed and the war generation aged and died, the urgency of preserving their stories and honouring their experiences grew stronger. Museums and memorials were built, oral histories collected, anniversaries commemorated. The war became history rather than living memory, studied by scholars, taught in schools, represented in films and books and documentaries. But even as it became history, it remained personally meaningful to millions of people whose lives had been shaped by it, whose identities and families and futures had been determined in large part by what had happened during those terrible years. The war was not just past but prologue, not just history but heritage, not just something that had been, but something that continued to matter, to shape the world, to teach lessons that we ignore at our peril. The question of how to remember the war, how to honour those who lived through it, how to learn from it without simplifying or sanitizing it, remains vital and contested. Different communities and nations emphasize different aspects, draw different lessons, create different narratives. These differences matter, but what matters more is the commitment to remember, to bear witness, to ensure that the suffering and sacrifice and survival all have meaning, all continue to matter. And so we come to the end of this long story, this exploration of what getting through World War II actually did to people. We have seen that it marked them indelibly, that it taught them harsh but valuable lessons, that it broke some and strengthened others, and did both to most. We have seen that the effects rippled forward through time, affecting not just those who directly experienced the war, but their children and grandchildren, shaping the world in ways both obvious and subtle. The people who lived through World War II showed us what humans are capable of enduring, what we can survive, what strength can emerge from suffering. They showed us both the worst and best of human nature, both terrible cruelty and beautiful compassion. They left us a legacy of memory and understanding that we must cherish and protect, that we must pass on to future generations, that we must use to build a world where such suffering never happens again. Their quiet strength echoes still, in the choices we make, in the values we hold, in the world they help to build and that we continue to shape. We honour them not through idealization or simplification, but through honest remembrance, through acknowledging both what they endured and how it marked them, through learning from their experiences without repeating their mistakes, through building on their strengths while addressing the traumas they could not fully heal. The war did something to people that can never be fully undone, that mark them for life, that shaped their descendants. But they survived. They persisted. They found reasons to go on, reasons to hope, reasons to love and build and create despite everything. And in their survival and their persistence, in their determination to make meaning from suffering and to create better futures from terrible pasts, they teach us still about the resilience of the human spirit, about the power of hope, about the enduring strength of those who refuse to be defeated even when everything seems lost. The letters written during wartime, millions and millions of them crossing oceans and continents, carried between soldiers and their families, between evacuated children and parents, between lovers separated by war. These letters were lifelines, vital connections that maintained relationships across distances and dangers that threatened to sever them forever. People wrote with whatever they could find on scraps of paper, on the backs of official forms, in tiny handwriting to fit more words onto limited space, knowing that these letters might take weeks or months to arrive, might never arrive at all if ships were sunk or convoys attacked. The writing of these letters required balancing honesty with protection, wanting to share experiences and feelings, but also not wanting to cause unnecessary worry or to violate censorship rules that prohibited mentioning specific locations or military details. Soldiers wrote cheerfully about small comforts and minor adventures, leaving out the horror and fear and exhaustion that defined their daily existence. Families wrote about neighborhood news and children's small achievements, downplaying the hardships and dangers of the home front. Everyone performed a version of a normalcy through these letters, creating parallel realities where life went on much as it always had, where the writers would surely be reunited soon, and everything would return to the way it had been. Reading letters from home became a sacred ritual for soldiers, something to be done in whatever privacy could be found, to be savoured and reread until the paper wore thin along the creases. A letter from home was proof that the other world still existed, that family and love and ordinary life persisted somewhere beyond the hell of combat. It was a reminder of what was being fought for, what waited on the other side of survival, what made it worth enduring one more day, one more mission, one more brush with death. For those at home, letters from the front were simultaneously hoped for and feared. Their arrival brought relief that the sender had been alive at least when the letter was written, but the delay between writing and arrival meant that this was always past tense reassurance, already outdated by the time it arrived. The absence of letters created terrible anxiety. Each day without news, a day of wondering if something terrible had happened, if the next communication would be not a letter, but a telegram bringing news of death or capture. The photographs that people enclosed with letters, small black and white images of children who had grown, of soldiers in uniform trying to look brave and confident, of houses and neighbourhoods and ordinary scenes meant to bridge the gap of distance and time. These photographs became treasured possessions, carried close to the body, looked at countless times, touchstones of connection and memory. When soldiers died, these photographs were often found on their bodies, evidence of what had mattered most to them, who they had been fighting for, what they had hoped to return to. The music of the wartime years, the songs that people sang and listened to, created a shared emotional landscape that helped people feel connected even when separated. Songs like We'll Meet Again and I'll Be Seeing You, and countless others captured the longing and hope and melancholy of wartime separation, gave voice to feelings that people struggled to express in their own words. Hearing these songs on the radio or singing them together in shelters or at dances created moments of collective emotion. reminders that everyone was going through similar experiences of loss and longing, that the pain was shared even when it felt utterly personal and isolating. The food that people ate or did not eat during the war years, the constant calculations of rationing and scarcity, the creativity required to make meals from inadequate ingredients, these daily struggles with nutrition shaped bodies and minds in lasting ways. Children who grew up malnourished during the war years often showed effects decades later in their health and longevity. The psychological relationship with food developed during wartime, the awareness of scarcity, the inability to waste even the smallest scrap persisted long after food became abundant again, shaping eating habits and household practices for the rest of people's lives. The recipes that women developed to work with wartime limitations became family traditions, passed down through generations not because they were particularly delicious, but because they carried memories, because they connected the present to that difficult past, because making wartime cake or victory garden stew was a way of honouring what that generation had endured and survived. Food became a link between past and present, between deprivation and abundance, between the worst times and better days that followed. The homes people returned to after the war, or built in its aftermath, carried both visible and invisible marks of those years. Houses that had been damaged by bombing and then repaired showed scars in their structures, patches and rebuilds that never quite matched the original construction. But even homes that had not been physically damaged carried the weight of what had happened within them, the separations and griefs, the fears and hopes, all the strong emotions that had been experienced within those walls, leaving traces that could be felt even if they could not be seen. The churches and temples and synagogues that had served as centres of community and comfort during the war years, where people had gathered to pray for safety and victory, to mark deaths and celebrate returns, to find meaning and connection in the midst of chaos, these sacred spaces held the accumulated prayers and tears of those years, absorbed them somehow into their very fabric, becoming repositories of collective memory and emotion. The teachers who had continued to educate children through the war years, who had maintained some continuity of learning and normalcy despite endless disruptions, who had helped children process their fears and experiences while also trying to keep them engaged in academic work. These teachers shaped not just individual students, but entire generations, influencing how children understood the world and their place in it, helping them maintain hope and purpose when everything else seemed to be falling apart. The doctors and nurses who had treated civilian casualties and disease, who had struggled with inadequate supplies and overwhelming numbers of patients, who had watched people die of conditions that might have been treatable in peacetime. These medical professionals carried their own forms of trauma, their own impossible memories, their own questions about whether they had done enough, made the right choices, saved all the lives that might have been saved. The factory workers who had produced the materials of war, the munitions and vehicles and equipment, working long hours in dangerous conditions, contributing to the war effort through their labour, even as they worried about loved ones fighting on distant fronts. These workers understood their work as meaningful service, as essential contribution. But they also sometimes struggled with the knowledge of what their products were used for, the destruction they enabled, the deaths they indirectly caused. The farmers who had grown food for their nations and allies, who had worked to increase production despite shortages of labour and equipment, who had dealt with rationing and price controls and the uncertainty of markets disrupted by war. These agricultural workers maintained one of the most fundamental services, feeding populations that might otherwise have starved, enabling continued resistance and eventual victory, their contribution less dramatic than combat, but absolutely essential. the artists and writers and musicians who had created work during the war years, who had used their talents to document and interpret and make meaning from what was happening, who had provided entertainment and distraction, and emotional catharsis for people desperate for any relief from the grinding reality of war. These creative people left a record of the human experience of those years that complemented and enriched the historical and statistical accounts, giving us access to the emotional and psychological dimensions of wartime existence. The children who'd been born during the war years, who had come into the world at a time of maximum danger and uncertainty, who'd been wanted and welcomed despite or perhaps because of the darkness of the times, these children represented hope and continuity, a vote of confidence in the future despite all the reasons to despair. Their parents had brought them into a world at war with the determination that life would go on, that love and family mattered even when everything else was falling apart, that the next generation deserved to exist even if the present generation could not guarantee them safety or prosperity. The way different countries remembered and commemorated the war reflected their different experiences and perspectives, but also their different needs and purposes in the present. Nations that had been victorious emphasized heroism and sacrifice, the fight against evil, the vindication of their cause and their values. Nations that had been defeated or occupied struggled with questions of complicity and resistance, with shame and pride mixed in complicated proportions, with the challenge of acknowledging what had happened while also moving forward into a different kind of future. The international relationships that emerged from the war, the alliances and antagonisms, the new configurations of power and influence, shaped global politics for decades to come. The United Nations, the Marshall Plan, the beginnings of European integration, the establishment of international human rights frameworks, all of these represented attempts to institutionalize the lessons learned from the war, to create structures that would prevent future catastrophes, or at least provide mechanisms for addressing conflicts before they erupted into total war. The nuclear age that was inaugurated by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki created a fundamentally new reality, one in which human beings possessed the capacity to destroy civilization and perhaps even make the planet uninhabitable. This terrible knowledge shaped the Cold War that followed World War II, creating a balance of terror in which the fear of mutual destruction hopefully prevented the use of the weapons that made such destruction possible. The generations who grew up under the shadow of nuclear weapons carried a particular kind of existential anxiety, or awareness that the world could end not in some distant apocalyptic future, but potentially tomorrow, in a flash of light and heat that would make all human concerns and conflicts suddenly and permanently irrelevant. The technological developments that had been accelerated by the war, from radar and jet engines to computers and antibiotics, reshaped civilian life in the post-war decades, creating new possibilities and new problems, new connections and new divides. The war had shown what could be accomplished when resources and ingenuity were mobilized toward common purpose, and this lesson informed post-war projects from space exploration to the development of welfare states, ambitious undertakings that might not have seemed possible or desirable without the precedent of wartime mobilization. The social changes that had been set in motion by the war, particularly around gender roles and racial equity, continued to unfold in the decades that followed, though not as quickly or completely as those who had fought for change might have hoped. The women who had worked in war industries and served in auxiliary military roles had proved that they were capable of work traditionally reserved for men, but they were nonetheless expected to return to domestic life when the war ended, expected to be content with secondary status and limited opportunities. The resentment and frustration this created contributed to the eventual emergence of second-wave feminism in the 1960s and 1970s, as the daughters of the war generation rejected the limitations their mothers had accepted or been forced to accept. The racial segregation that had characterized the American military during the war, the way that black soldiers and other minorities had been relegated to support roles and denied equal recognition for their contributions, became increasingly untenable in light of the war's rhetoric about fighting for freedom and democracy. How could a nation claim to be defending freedom while denying basic rights to millions of its own citizens? This contradiction helped fuel the civil rights movement, as veterans who had fought for their country demanded the rights and respect they had earned, as activists pointed to the gap between American ideals and American realities. The displacement of millions of people during and after the war created refugee populations whose impacts would be felt for generations. The partition of India, the redrawing of borders in Europe, the creation of Israel, the occupation of Japan and the division of Korea, all of these post-war developments involved massive population movements, millions of people forced from their homes, compelled to start new lives in unfamiliar places, carrying with them the traumas of war and displacement that would affect them and their descendants for decades to come. The environmental impacts of the war, from the physical destruction of landscapes to the contamination from chemical weapons and nuclear testing, created legacies that persisted long after the fighting stopped. Unexploded ordnance still killed and maimed people decades after being dropped or buried. Land rendered unusable by battle or contamination took generations to recover, if it recovered at all. The war taught lessons about human capacity to damage the natural world, lessons that would inform later environmental movements even as they failed to prevent continuing environmental destruction. And as we finally reach the end of this long journey through what getting through World War II actually did to people, we must acknowledge that any such exploration is necessarily incomplete, that there are always more stories, more perspectives, more experiences that deserve to be included but cannot be, that the full truth of what the war did to people is too vast and complex to ever be entirely captured in words, no matter how many are written. What we can say with certainty is that the war marked everyone it touched, that its effects rippled forward through time and continue to shape our world, that the people who lived through it were changed in ways both obvious and subtle, that they carried wounds that never fully healed alongside strength that persisted through their lives, that they left us a legacy of memory and understanding that we must treasure and preserve and learn from. Their quiet strength, forged in the crucible of suffering and loss, tested by years of endurance and uncertainty, proved through survival against terrible odds, this strength echoes still. It reminds us of what humans can endure when we must, what we can overcome when we have no choice, what depths of resilience exist within us, even when we doubt our own capacity to continue. But it also reminds us of the cost of such strength, of the terrible price paid by those who endured and by their descendants who inherited trauma they did not directly experience. It reminds us that survival alone is not enough, that we must also work to heal, to create conditions where such extreme endurance is not required, where people can live without the constant threat of violence and destruction, where strength can be built through growth and challenge rather than through trauma and survival. The war taught that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things, both terrible and beautiful. It showed that humans can inflict unimaginable cruelty on one another, but also that we can show remarkable compassion and courage. It demonstrated that hope can persist in the darkest circumstances, but also that hope alone is not enough, that it must be coupled with action, with the determined effort to build better realities than the ones we inherit. And so we remember, we bear witness. We honour those who lived through the war by trying to understand what they endured, by acknowledging both their suffering and their survival, by learning from their experiences without romanticising or simplifying them, by using what they taught us to build a world where such suffering is less likely, where war is a last resort rather than a first response, where human dignity and human rights are protected even in times of conflict. Their story is our story, because we are shaped by what they lived through, because the world they built is the world we inhabit, because the choices they made and the values they held or abandoned or clung to despite everything, all of this continues to influence us whether we recognize it or not. We owe them the honor of remembrance, the commitment to learn, the determination to build on their strengths while healing from their traumas, the dedication to creating futures worthy of their sacrifice and their survival. And with that, our long story ends. Though the echoes continue, though the effects persist, though the work of understanding and honouring and learning from what getting through World War II did to people goes on, generation after generation, each of us adding our own chapter to a story that is never quite finished, never quite resolved, always demanding more of us, always teaching us something new about what it means to be human, to suffer, to endure, to hope, to love, to build and rebuild and continue despite everything, always continuing, always carrying forward the light that those who came before us kept alive through the darkest nights, passing it to us so that we might keep it burning, might pass it in turn to those who will come after, an endless relay of memory and hope and human persistence across the generations, connecting us all in a chain of suffering and survival that defines what we are and calls us always to be better, to do better, to build a world more worthy of those who endured so much to give it to us. The photographs taken during the war years, whether by professional photographers documenting the conflict or by ordinary people trying to capture moments of their lives, created a visual archive that helps us understand what those years looked like, how people presented themselves, what they chose to record and remember. A soldier posing with his unit, trying to look confident despite the fear in his eyes. A family gathered around a table for a holiday meal, the empty chairs a silent testament to those who could not be present. Children playing in rubble, their games adapting to the landscape of destruction around them. A wedding celebrated despite or because of wartime uncertainties. The bride in a borrowed dress, the groom in uniform, both knowing he would ship out in days and not knowing if they would ever see each other again. These photographs freeze moments in time, preserve faces and places that might otherwise have been lost to memory. But they also reveal what the camera could not capture, the emotions behind the posed smiles, the stories that led to and followed from the instant the shutter clicked, the vast context of war that surrounded each small recorded moment. Looking at these photographs decades later, we see both what was there and what was not, both the documentary evidence and its limitations, both connection to the past and distance from it. And so, at the very end of this exploration of what getting through World War II actually did to people, we are left with both knowledge and mystery, with understanding and questions, with connection to those who lived through the war and recognition of the vast gulf that separates their experience from our own. We have travelled together through the daily struggles and hidden weights, through the nights in shelters and the roads home, through the experiences of soldiers and civilians and children, and all the countless others whose lives were shaped and marked by those terrible years. We have seen resilience and fragility, strength and vulnerability, suffering and survival, all existing together in complex and sometimes contradictory ways. We have seen how the war asked more of people than should ever be asked, how it took from them what should never have been taken, and how despite everything, they endured, they persisted, they found ways to keep living and loving and hoping. Their quiet strength echoes still in the world they built, in the values they passed on, in the memories they preserved or chose not to preserve, in the ways they shaped their children and grandchildren, in the institutions and systems they created or failed to create, in the lessons they taught through word and example and silence. We honour them best not through idealization but through honest remembrance, through learning from both their triumphs and their failures, through building on what they gave us while working to heal the wounds they could not fully address. The story of what World War II did to people is ultimately a story about the human capacity for endurance and adaptation, about the terrible resilience that allows us to survive almost anything, and the equally terrible cost of that survival. It is a story that must be told and retold, remembered and re-examined, honoured and learned from, generation after generation, so that we never forget what humans are capable of doing to one another and what we are capable of surviving, so that we use that knowledge to build a world where such suffering becomes less likely, where war is truly a last resort, where human dignity is protected and human life valued. And with that our story truly ends, though its echoes continue forever, teaching us still about endurance and hope, about suffering and survival, about the quiet strength of ordinary people who lived through extraordinary times and who left us a legacy of memory and meaning that we must treasure and preserve and learn from, always remembering, always honouring, always working to build a world worthy of their sacrifice and their survival.